Ark Raiders is hiding some of the most unsettling Easter eggs I have ever come across in a video game, and over the next 3 hours, I am going to walk you through all 73 of them one by one. Hey, welcome back. So this video has been a while in the making, and I want to take a moment before we get into it to explain what it is and why I put it together. Ark Raiders is an extraction shooter, and like a lot of games in that genre, a massive portion of its actual storytelling happens in the background. It's not in cutscenes or dialogue trees. It's in the environment. It's in the texture of broken rooms and item descriptions and audio details that most players walk right past because they're trying to survive and move on. I started noticing these details a few months back, and once I started looking for them, I genuinely could not stop. 73 of them made it into this video, and every single one adds something to the overall picture of what this world is and how it ended up this way. One specific choice I made when putting this together was the order. I did not sort these Easter eggs by in-game location, and I did not sort them by when the community found them. I organised them thematically, because when you line them up that way, they start speaking to each other. Something from the first chapter connects back to something in the 7th, and I think that structure makes the whole thing more satisfying to sit with. I also decided early on to frame everything as interpretation rather than confirmed canon, because a significant portion of this material is genuinely ambiguous. Ark Raiders is not a game that hands you answers. It gives you fragments and trusts you to do something with them. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The World Before the Ark. We are starting at the beginning. Not the beginning of the game, but the beginning of the story. The world of Ark Raiders is a world that used to be something entirely different, and the game makes a genuine effort to show you what that earlier version looked like. The first 8 Easter eggs in this video are all about that. They are things embedded in the environment that suggest what ordinary daily life looked like before everything fell apart, and they are, in their own quiet way, some of the most disturbing things in the entire game. Not because they are violent or graphic, but because of how recognisable they feel. There is a specific kind of discomfort that comes from looking at the remains of something normal. These first 8 entries are built almost entirely out of that discomfort. Easter egg 1 is one I keep returning to, and it involves something that the majority of players never stop to look at because they are focused on the structure and layout of buildings rather than the smaller details inside them. In several of the residential areas, accessible during a standard run, there are wall calendars still mounted near doorways and in kitchen spaces. These are not random decorative props placed there to suggest habitation. If you take the time to look at the specific dates circled or marked on these calendars, they cluster around a very narrow window of time. The same general week appears circled in multiple different households, across multiple different buildings, in multiple different areas of the game. That repetition is not accidental. It points towards something the game never explicitly states, which is the idea that ordinary people had some level of awareness that something significant was approaching. Not full knowledge, not a clear picture, but enough to track a date. One possible reading of this detail is that some kind of public signal was issued in the days before the initial Ark arrival. Not a formal evacuation order, not yet, but something broadcast or distributed widely enough that families in separate homes all marked the same stretch of days. The game does not give you a news broadcast to confirm this reading. It does not hand you a government document or a radio transcript. Instead, it gives you these faded wall calendars, still hanging exactly where someone left them, and it lets you draw your own conclusions from the pattern. That is a very deliberate, creative choice, and it suggests that the developers wanted the player to feel the specific weight of that period of anticipation, a time when people knew something was wrong, but did not yet know exactly what. What makes this Easter egg particularly effective is the variety of what else appears on the same calendars alongside the circled dates. One has a birthday marked 2 weeks past that circled window, which tells you that the person who owned this calendar expected to still be around for that birthday. Another has a grocery list written in the margin in ordinary handwriting, practical and mundane, and the contrast between that mundane detail and the circled date is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. It asks a quiet question about what it feels like to be going about your daily routine, writing grocery lists and planning birthday celebrations, while also watching a date on a calendar that you know is going to change everything. The game does not answer that question. It just leaves the calendars on the walls and lets you feel it. This kind of environmental detail is something Ark Raiders does consistently and with real intention throughout its world. And that consistency is what separates these calendars from ordinary set dressing. The developers could have populated these spaces with generic, unreadable textures. Instead, they put specific dates on specific calendars and made sure those dates matched across locations separated by significant in-game distance. That level of coordination requires intention at the design level. It tells you that someone on the development team decided that the pre-Ark world needed to feel real and specific, not just generically ruined, and the calendars are one of the clearest demonstrations of that philosophy. It is also worth noting that the circled dates on these calendars do not precisely align with any confirmed lore event that the game has publicly documented. The dates point toward a period of anticipation, a before, but what specifically those dates correspond to remains unresolved. That ambiguity feels intentional. The game wants you to feel the weight of a coming deadline without giving you enough context to fully understand what the deadline meant. It is a particular kind of unease, the kind you feel when you know something is approaching without being able to name it, and the calendars deliver that sensation without a single line of spoken dialogue. After spending time with the calendars, the question that stays with you is very simple and very uncomfortable. Who was the last person to look at that calendar? Who drew that circle? Where did they go after they put the marker down? The game offers no answer, and that silence is more resonant than any answer would be. The calendar just hangs there, with the circle around a date that has long since passed in a world that did not survive it. Easter Egg 2 is found in what remains of a primary school building located within one of the residential zones. The school is heavily damaged in the way most structures are, but several interior rooms are more intact than you might expect from the exterior. One of these rooms still has student artwork pinned to the walls, drawings made in crayon and marker by children who were clearly young when they made them, displayed in the standard way that primary schools display student work, with names written carefully at the bottom of each piece. At first glance, these drawings are exactly what you would expect: houses, families, pets, trees, suns in the corners, the subjects that children gravitate toward when given blank paper and access to a box of crayons. But there is something wrong with a consistent subset of these drawings that becomes apparent when you look at them with attention rather than passing through the room. Several of the drawings, clearly made by different children, given the variation in style and handwriting on the name labels, include a shape in the sky. Not a sun, not a bird or a plane, or any of the standard sky objects children typically include. A shape, dark in most of the drawings, though rendered in different colours and with different levels of artistic precision. Appearing again and again across the work of different children in the same position, floating above their scenes of houses and families and everyday life. A shape that all of these children, independently of one another, felt compelled to include in their pictures. One possible reading of this is that the children were already observing something before the formal Ark arrival, that some early presence in the upper atmosphere or orbit was visible to people looking up, and that children, who tend to pay more deliberate attention to the sky than adults, incorporated what they saw into their artwork without fully understanding its significance. This reading is supported by how the shape appears in context. It is not depicted as a threat in any of the drawings. It is not shown attacking or looming. It is simply there, included as a feature of the sky, the way children include clouds, as a thing that was present and therefore worth drawing. The name labels on these drawings are a specific kind of detail worth lingering on. They are ordinary names, the kinds of names you would find in a primary school, in many different places and in many different times. Written in the careful, effortful handwriting of children still learning to form letters. The combination of those ordinary, effortful names with the recurring dark shape in the sky above their houses creates a particular sadness that the game does not underline or draw attention to. It does not tell you what happened to these children. It shows you their artwork, with their names on it, and the shape they all kept drawing, and it leaves the rest to you. What makes this Easter egg stay with you is the accumulation of those details. A single drawing with a strange shape in the sky might be coincidence or artistic idiosyncrasy. Multiple drawings by multiple children, each with their name written beneath it, all featuring the same recurring element in the same general position. That is a pattern. That is something these kids were all looking at and finding significant enough to include. The game trusts you to make that connection without being directed toward it, and that trust is what distinguishes strong environmental storytelling from the kind that over-explains itself. There is also the question of what the teachers thought when these drawings came in. Did they notice the shape? Did they ask the children about it? Did they understand what they were looking at? The game leaves all of that completely open, but the fact that the drawings were pinned to the wall in the standard way, displayed the way good student work always is, suggests that whoever mounted them either did not notice the anomaly or did not find it alarming enough to flag. That normalcy is its own quiet horror. These drawings were selected and displayed, and the shape in the sky was treated as just another part of the picture, just part of what the children saw. There is one small additional detail in these drawings worth mentioning. One child drew the sky shape in orange crayon rather than the darker tones used by everyone else. It might mean nothing. It might mean this particular child saw the shape at a different time of day, in different light, or it might just mean this child liked orange. The game does not tell you. But once you notice the orange shape sitting among all the darker ones, you find yourself trying to make something of it. And that impulse, the reaching for meaning in a detail that may or may not have any, is very much the experience Ark Raiders is designed to produce. Easter egg 3 moves us from public spaces into private ones. In one of the more intact residential structures, tucked away in what was clearly a bedroom, there is a greeting card. It sits on a surface near where a bed would have been, positioned carefully, not displaced by whatever happened to the rest of the building. It is a wedding anniversary card. The exterior design has faded significantly, but the interior is still legible, and what it contains is one of the more quietly devastating pieces of text in the game. The message inside is handwritten, a few sentences of warmth and gratitude that read like the kind of things someone writes when they have known another person long enough to be past formal sentiment and settled into something more honest. What makes this Easter egg worth examining closely is not the emotional content itself, but the specific details embedded within it. The writer mentions a number of years, which gives you a precise anniversary window. And that window, if you calculate it against the contextual timeline the game suggests, falls very close to the same period, referenced by the circled dates on the calendars in Easter egg 1. This card was written during the before. One possible reading of that timing is that someone wrote this anniversary message during the period of anticipation, in the days when people were watching a circled date on a calendar and not quite knowing what it meant. They wrote it and placed it in the bedroom, and either they never had the chance to give it, or they gave it and the recipient left it there when things fell apart quickly and there was no time to take anything. Either way, the card was meant to mark a continuation. Another year, another anniversary, another act of love in an ongoing life. Instead, it became a marker of an ending. That gap between intention and outcome gives this Easter egg its weight. The card also includes a postscript at the bottom, just below the main message. It is brief and lighter in tone, more casual than the rest of the text. It references a plan, going somewhere together, something that required leaving the house, something that was still in the future when the card was written. This postscript was clearly added after the main message as an afterthought or an addition, the kind of thing you scrawl at the bottom of a card when you want to include something practical alongside something sentimental. It says, "We have a future." It says, "Here is a thing we're going to do in it." The contrast between that forward-looking lightness and the world currently surrounding that card is very difficult to stay with. The bedroom around the card provides additional context. The room is orderly. Personal items are in positions that suggest they were placed there deliberately, not displaced by chaos or looting. This tells you that whatever happened here happened quickly, not slowly, not with time to gather things or make decisions about what to take. Whoever was in this room was there, and then they were not, and the room stayed exactly as it was. The card stayed on the surface near the bed with its anniversary message and its optimistic postscript about a plan that never happened. This Easter egg works because it is specific in a way that generic environmental storytelling rarely manages. A wedding anniversary card does not just tell you that someone was present, it tells you the shape of their life, the length of a relationship, the texture of an affection. It constructs a person out of absence, and it does so using only a few lines of handwritten text in a room that would otherwise just be a damaged space in a damaged building. The specificity is what makes it linger. You do not just sense that someone was here, you almost feel like you knew them. Easter egg 4 takes us into a commercial zone. In one of the game's shopping or market areas, there is a storefront sign that is still partially illuminated. The sign advertises a consumer product, something entirely ordinary from the pre-Ark world, unremarkable in itself. What is notable is the slogan still visible on the sign. The slogan uses the word tomorrow in its phrasing. It references tomorrow as something certain, something you can bank on, something that reliably arrives, and when it does, things will be better. The sign was built to promise a future in the uncomplicated way that advertising always promises futures, and it has now been standing in a collapsed world for what the game implies is a very long time. The framing of that slogan, without quoting it directly, plays on themes of improvement and progress. The tomorrow it invokes is an upgraded version of today, a better outcome just around the corner. And standing in the context of what the game's world has actually become, that language lands entirely differently than it was designed to. The sign was not trying to be ironic, it was doing exactly what commercial signage does. But the world changed around it and left the sign still advertising, still promising, still illuminated by a power source that has not yet given out. That persistence is the detail that gives this Easter egg its edge. Somewhere beneath this commercial area, something is still supplying power to this sign. The grid failed, the society collapsed, the product being advertised no longer exists in any meaningful sense, and the sign kept going, still cycling through its partial illumination, still presenting its slogan about tomorrow to any passerby who might wander through. There are no passers-by in the conventional sense, there is only you, in a ruined zone, watching a sign tell you to look forward to a future that already arrived and was nothing like what the sign had in mind. One possible reading of this Easter egg is that it is purely atmospheric, a detail chosen for ambience rather than lore significance, but the placement of the sign is hard to set aside entirely. It faces one of the main navigation routes through this commercial area, positioned such that it is nearly impossible to miss on a standard path through the zone. The developers put it somewhere players would see it. They kept the illumination working. They left the slogan readable. None of those are accidental choices. Together they suggest that the sign is intended to communicate something specific about the world rather than just fill visual space. What the sign does most effectively is capture the relationship between commercial language and collective optimism. Before the arc, tomorrow was something you could sell, something you could attach to a product. Societies build entire industries around the promise of a better future, and all of that language survived the societies that produced it. The sign keeps advertising. The product is gone. The infrastructure that made the product is gone. The people who would have bought it are gone. And the sign keeps advertising, lit up in the dark, promising tomorrow. Easter egg 5 is one that many players register on some level, but do not think about deeply, because it reads as background atmosphere at first. In several zones throughout the game, working traffic signals are present. Red, yellow, green, cycling through their patterns the way they always did. The roads beneath them are empty. There are no vehicles anywhere nearby, and in most of these locations the road surface itself is damaged enough to be impassable. But the signals keep cycling. Red, green, yellow. Red again. Traffic signals are one of the most fundamental expressions of social coordination in the modern world. They exist because individual people left to manage intersections without guidance do not naturally coordinate effectively at scale. The signal creates a shared rule. Everybody stops at red and goes at green, and something that could be chaotic becomes orderly. In Arc Raiders, that rule is still being issued. The signal is still managing the intersection, but there is nobody to manage. The coordination apparatus continues running in the absence of anyone to coordinate. One particular location makes this more pointed than it reads in the abstract. A traffic signal stands at an intersection where 2 of the 4 connected roads are completely impassable, blocked not by light damage, but by substantial structural collapse. You could not drive through this intersection, even if you had a vehicle, even if the road were clear in other directions. The signal is still cycling, still assigning right of way at an intersection that cannot be navigated, still doing its job in circumstances where its job is functionally meaningless. That specificity feels deliberate. A signal cycling at a merely empty intersection is atmospheric. A signal cycling at an intersection where movement is physically impossible is something more specific. The green light moment is what stays with you. Every time the signal completes its cycle and reaches green, there is a brief interval where the scene looks almost right. The light is green, the road is present, and for just a moment, the setting looks like a place you could move through. Normal, navigable, and then the rubble and the stillness and the absence register, and the moment passes. That cycle repeats indefinitely. That brief window of apparent normalcy appearing and disappearing over and over in an empty city is, in its low-key way, one of the stranger experiences the game produces. The broader implication of functioning traffic signals connects to what they reveal about power infrastructure. Something is still supplying electricity to these signals. That something is presumably running without maintenance. It is drawing on reserves that will eventually exhaust themselves, at which point the signals will go dark. But that moment has not come yet. For now, red cycles to green cycles to yellow cycles, back to red, in the patient, indifferent rhythm of a system that was built to run without needing anyone to tell it when to run. Easter egg 6 takes us into a diner, one of the game's more legible pre-arc spaces. The familiarity of the setting is part of what makes what you find inside it work. Diners are instantly readable as spaces. You know what they were for, what they would have sounded like, what energy they would have carried. In this particular diner, on a table toward the back, there is a partially completed newspaper crossword puzzle. The newspaper is damaged, but still legible in the relevant sections. The puzzle is roughly half finished. The completed portion of the crossword contains mostly ordinary fill words, the short common answers that populate the easier sections of any puzzle. But 2 specific answers in the completed grid, positioned adjacent to each other, stand out for players familiar with Ark Raider's broader lore terminology. One is a proper noun that appears in the game's wider narrative context. The other is a common word whose meaning shifts when placed next to the proper noun in the way the grid arranges them. Together, they form something that could be interpreted as an embedded message, a small deliberate wink from the development team hidden in what appears to be a generic prop. I want to be clear that this is one of the more speculative entries in this chapter. Crossword grids are constrained by structural rules, and the words that end up adjacent are partly determined by the grid layout rather than pure authorial choice. Coincidences happen in crossword grids, but the specific words involved, their relevance to the game's established lore, and the visible positioning of the puzzle on an easily noticed surface all push this toward intentionality rather than accident. It fits the philosophy of detail that Ark Raiders demonstrates throughout its world. One possible reading is that a developer used this crossword prop to tuck a small lore note into an unexpected location, the kind of thing that the vast majority of players will never find, but that rewards the ones who are paying close enough attention to crouch over a table in a ruined diner and read a partially completed puzzle. This kind of hidden reference is consistent with how the game handles world building generally, implication over exposition, fragments rather than explanations. The pencil is still in the puzzle. That is the detail that does not let go. Whoever was working through this crossword put the pencil down mid-entry. It rests across the grid at an angle, as if set down for just a moment. Not deliberately set aside, not put away, not moved. Just placed down quickly, in the way you put a pen or pencil down, when something interrupts you briefly, and you expect to pick it back up in a moment. And then the moment never came. That is the distinction that matters here. A crossword left unfinished on a table could mean many things, but a crossword with the pencil still resting across it means something specific. It means the interruption was not expected to be permanent. The person who put that pencil down thought they were coming back to it. The pencil's position is a record of that assumption. The state of the world around the diner is a record of how that assumption turned out. Easter Egg 7 involves emergency broadcast infrastructure. Across several locations in the game, you can find the physical hardware associated with emergency communication systems, transmitters, control panels, recording equipment, patch cables. Most of this equipment is damaged or completely inactive. In one specific location, however, a piece of emergency broadcast equipment is still powered and running. Its indicator lights are cycling. If you position yourself close to it and pay attention to the audio layer of the environment, the equipment is producing a signal. A low, steady tone that corresponds to the test frequency that emergency broadcast systems traditionally use before transmitting an actual alert, the precursor tone. The signal that says the system is live and the message is coming. The unsettling implication is about sequence. An emergency broadcast system running a test tone means that whoever powered it up and ran the test never got to the next step. They set up the equipment, verified that the system was live, produced the test tone as confirmation, and then the message they were going to broadcast never followed. The system has been running that test tone ever since. Not a broadcast, a preparation for a broadcast, a system permanently stuck in the moment just before the actual communication was supposed to happen. One possible reading is that the operator was assembling an emergency alert in the days leading up to the Ark arrival, in the same window suggested by the circled dates in Easter Egg 1. The equipment was set up, the test confirmed, and then the event the alert was meant to warn people about arrived before the warning could be issued. The test tone kept running because nobody came back to turn it off or replace it with a message. It has been running its loop ever since, still technically functioning as a pre-transmission signal, still waiting for the broadcast that should follow it. The location of this equipment adds a specific texture to this reading. It is not in a dedicated professional radio facility. The space looks improvised, like someone assembled this setup in a hurry from equipment not originally installed in that location. Patch cables run in ways that suggest quick assembly rather than planned installation. This supports the reading that this was an emergency measure, a rapid attempt to get a warning out through whatever was available rather than an established and maintained broadcast operation. The improvisation is consistent with the incomplete outcome. What that test tone does to the audio environment of its location is subtle but real. Most of the ambient audio in Ark Raider's world is the silence of abandonment, broken by machine sounds and wind and environmental noise. The test tone is human in origin. It was made by something built by people for a specific human purpose. It is still fulfilling the preliminary portion of that purpose. Just the preliminary portion, just the test. The message never came, and the tone keeps sounding where the message should have been. In the context of everything else explored in this chapter, that running test tone is its own quiet description of a world that ran out of time at the exact moment it was trying to respond to something. Easter egg 8 is the simplest entry in this chapter, and in some ways the most effective. It is not a document or a piece of equipment or a surviving piece of commercial signage. It is a pet food bowl. Outside one of the residential structures, in a suburban area, placed close to the exterior wall of the building, in the position where you would put a bowl for an animal that spends time outdoors. The bowl is empty. It has been empty for a long time, based on the weathering visible on the surface around it. But it is there. It was placed by someone who was filling it regularly, and at some point the filling stopped, and the bowl stayed where it was. This Easter egg functions entirely through implication and does not require any additional context to work. You see the bowl, and you understand it immediately. Someone lived here and cared for an animal and is no longer here, and the animal is no longer here, and the bowl sits exactly where it was left the last time someone filled it or came out intending to fill it. It was not brought inside when things fell apart. It was not packed. It was just there, where it always was, in the way something stays when the person who placed it expected to be back shortly. One possible reading, situated within the context of this chapter's larger pattern, is that this bowl belongs to the same moment as the pencil in the crossword, and the postscript in the anniversary card, and the test tone in the broadcast equipment. All of these details describe the same thing from different angles, people in the middle of ordinary life, interrupted. Not preparing for an ending with dramatic finality, but simply living in the texture of daily routine and then abruptly not living in it. The bowl is part of that texture. Filling it was part of someone's morning. And then the morning stopped. The bowl is a small detail in a large game. Most players pass it without consciously registering it. But it works in the way that peripheral details often work in well-constructed environments. It does not demand your attention. It just sits there and adds to a feeling. The feeling of a life that was here, specifically, concretely, visibly here, and specifically, concretely, no longer here. The emptiness of the bowl, and the weathering around it, and the fact that it was left in its working position, rather than moved or stored, does something quiet to the experience of the space around it. Those are the 8 Easter eggs of Chapter 1. What they share is a method. They work by showing you specific concrete remnants of an ordinary world and allowing the contrast with the current state of that world to carry the emotional weight. The game does not tell you that the pre-Ark world was populated by real people with real lives. It shows you their calendars and their children's drawings and their anniversary cards and their pet food bowls, and it trusts you to close the gap. That restraint, that trust in the audience, is what makes these details feel like something more than set dressing. Chapter 2. What the Machines Remember. The first chapter was about the world that existed before. This chapter is about the machines that changed it. Specifically, it is about details embedded in Ark machine behavior and design that suggest something more complex than simple hostile automation. Easter eggs, 9 through 16 all focus on the Ark themselves, and they are, by some measure, the most philosophically interesting entries in this video, because they point toward the possibility that the machines are not simply destroying a world. They may, on some level, be responding to it. Easter egg 9 concerns flight patterns. The Ark deploys a variety of aerial units throughout the game, ranging from smaller reconnaissance drones to larger patrol craft. If you spend time observing the flight paths of the smaller aerial units in the open zones, a specific pattern emerges over repeated observation. These drones are not flying random search patterns. They are following routes. And those routes, when you trace them against the underlying geography of the map, correspond closely to the major road infrastructure that existed in the pre-Ark world. Old highways, main arteries, connector roads between urban areas. The drones are flying the old road network. The immediate practical explanation for this is that roads represent the paths of least resistance through terrain, and a system optimized for coverage would naturally gravitate toward the most efficient routes, regardless of what those routes were originally designed for. That explanation is reasonable and probably correct on some level, but it does not fully account for the precision of the correlation. The drones are not just following terrain, they're following the specific paths that the pre-Ark road network described, including curves and deviations that are not dictated by the underlying landscape. They are following roads, specifically. Not just efficient terrain paths. One possible reading of this is that the Ark units are drawing on stored information about human infrastructure. That part of what the Ark did when they arrived was map the world as it was, record its structures and its networks, and build that information into their operational logic. If that reading is correct, the drones flying old highway routes are not following the roads because roads are efficient. They are following them because roads are what they know, because roads were recorded, because the road network is part of a data set that the Ark compiled about the world they entered, and that compiled data now drives their patrol patterns in a world where the roads they are following are no longer fully intact. This reading has implications worth sitting with. It suggests that the Ark's relationship to the pre-Ark world is not purely destructive. At least some aspect of what the Ark did was observational and archival. They recorded things before and during the collapse, and those recordings persist in their operational behavior. The drones following old highway routes are, in a strange and indirect way, a record of a world that no longer exists. The machines are carrying the map of the pre-Ark road network inside them as functional data, and that data shapes how they move through the ruins of that network. It is its own kind of memory. The specific routes that are most clearly traceable in drone behavior are the ones that would have been high-traffic corridors, the busiest roads, the ones most people would have used most often, which suggests that the Ark's archival priority may have correlated with human activity levels. The more used a route was, the more precisely the drones now follow it. The quieter back roads show less precise correlation. If that pattern is consistent, it implies that the Ark paid particular attention to where people went most, which raises questions about what information they were compiling and why frequency of human use mattered to that compilation. What makes this Easter egg land is that it requires time and observation to identify. You have to watch the drones more than once in more than one location, and you have to be thinking about the underlying geography at the same time. Players who are focused on avoiding detection or moving quickly through a zone will never notice it. It is a reward for the specific kind of player who watches the machines the way you would watch a natural phenomenon, who is curious about them rather than just afraid of them. And it tells that player something genuinely interesting about what the machines are. Easter egg 10 involves a specific location, not an individual machine unit, but a type of machine behavior observed consistently near a particular type of site. In the open world of Ark Raiders, there are memorials, small ones, informal ones, the kinds of markers that communities create in public spaces to commemorate specific events or individuals. Most of these have been damaged or displaced by the Ark's activity in the area, but a subset of them are intact. And near at least some of those intact memorials, specific Ark machine units demonstrate a behavioral anomaly. The anomaly is a pause, a brief interruption in the standard patrol cycle of certain ground units when they pass near these intact memorial structures. Not a stop, not a change of direction, just a pause of a few seconds, consistent across multiple observations of the same units at the same locations. The units resume their patrol after the pause, exactly as they would if nothing had interrupted them. But the pause is there, and it is not present when the same units pass other environmental objects of similar size and visual complexity. It is specific to the memorials. The most conservative reading of this is that the memorials contain materials that interfere briefly with the sensor systems of these particular machine types. A specific reflective surface or a material composition that causes a momentary processing interruption before the unit resolves the object as non-threatening. This is a plausible and probably the technically simplest explanation, but it does not sit entirely comfortably with the specificity of the correlation. Not all memorials produce the pause. Not all machine units produce the pause near the same memorial. The relationship between a specific subset of memorials and a specific type of machine behavior seems more selective than a simple sensor interference would produce. One possible reading, and this is speculative in the way that a lot of Ark Raiders' interpretation has to be, is that certain machines have something in their operational data that flags these specific locations as contextually significant in ways that differ from ordinary environmental objects. Not that the machines understand what a memorial is in any human sense, but that the data the Ark compiled about the world included information about these sites, and that information is weighted in a way that produces a different processing response when the machine encounters them. The pause is not reverence, it is a different kind of data evaluation, but the outcome, visually, looks like something else. What makes this Easter egg disturbing, rather than simply interesting, is what it implies about what the Ark recorded. If their archival process included information that effectively marks certain sites as contextually distinct in ways that persist in machine behavior after the site's context no longer exists, then the Ark assembled something more nuanced than a simple geographic map. They recorded something about human significance, about the fact that some locations were not just coordinates, but had weight attached to them. And now that weight persists in the machine's behavior, long after the human beings who gave those locations their significance are gone. Easter egg 11 is an audio-based observation that requires a specific piece of equipment and a very quiet area to verify. In a few locations in the game, Ark signal frequencies can be isolated and examined if you find the right functional scanner hardware. The frequencies these machines use for their communication and coordination protocols sit outside the range of normal human hearing in most cases. But a subset of the frequencies, when processed through scanner hardware and shifted into an audible range, correspond to something recognizable. Specifically, to the carrier frequencies that FM radio stations used in this region before the Ark's arrival. The machines are communicating on the old radio frequencies. The immediate practical explanation is again plausible and simple. The old FM radio spectrum was allocated and mapped and well documented. If the Ark scanned the electromagnetic environment before or during their arrival, those allocated frequencies would be part of what they recorded. Using those same frequency bands for machine communication would be operationally straightforward if the Ark systems are designed to slot into available spectrum rather than generate entirely new signal space. No human stations are broadcasting on those frequencies anymore, so from a purely practical standpoint, they are available and the machines are using them. But the specificity of the match is what keeps this Easter egg from being purely a technical footnote. It is not just that the machines are using a frequency range that used to contain radio stations. It is that specific machine communication protocols correspond to specific old station allocations, not the general band, the specific slots that specific stations occupied, which implies that the ARC's electromagnetic mapping was detailed enough to record individual station frequencies, and that this level of specificity influenced how they structured their own communication protocols. They did not just use the band, they used the specific slots. They fit themselves into the existing structure. One possible reading is that this reflects something about how the ARC approach and assimilate a world, not randomly broadcasting on whatever frequencies are available, but specifically occupying the existing electromagnetic structure of the environment they have entered, slotting their communication into the spaces that the invaded world's own communication occupied. If that is the ARC's standard operational approach, it has implications for what kind of intelligence is directing that approach and what the purpose of such precise assimilation might be. Are they trying to avoid detection by blending into existing signal patterns? Or is the assimilation itself part of something else? The game does not say. The experience of isolating these frequencies and recognizing what they correspond to is one of the more disorienting moments ARC Raiders produces for players who pursue it. You are scanning machine signals in a ruined world, and what comes back is the ghost of a radio landscape. The specific frequencies where specific stations used to broadcast are now carrying machine coordination traffic. The infrastructure of human communication has been occupied without any of the content that gave it meaning. Easter egg 12 follows from Easter egg 10 and extends it into a broader pattern. Not just memorials, but cemeteries. Specifically, the patrol routes of certain ground ARC units in areas near old cemeteries show a consistent deviation from the otherwise logical coverage pattern those units apply elsewhere. The units do not enter cemetery grounds with the same frequency or coverage density that they apply to adjacent areas of equivalent size and accessibility. The deviation is subtle enough that you might not notice it from a single observation, but across multiple runs and multiple units, the pattern holds. The machines patrol around cemeteries more than they patrol through them. This is one of the harder Easter eggs to confirm without careful observation across multiple sessions, which is probably why it remains under-discussed, despite being one of the more interesting behavioral anomalies the game contains. It is easy to attribute any individual deviation to terrain or pathing logic. It is harder to attribute a consistent, directional bias across multiple unit types over multiple observations to random pathing variation. The bias is real, and it is directed specifically at sites containing human remains. One possible reading is mundane. Cemetery ground is often softer or more irregular than surrounding terrain, which could affect the pathing calculations of ground units. The presence of markers and structures at irregular intervals could influence a coverage algorithm to prioritize other areas. These are real possibilities, but they sit uncomfortably alongside Easter egg 10, which identified a different behavioral anomaly around a different category of human memorial. Two separate anomalies, both directed at sites associated with human death and commemoration, strains the coincidence reading. The more speculative reading is that the ARC's operational data includes a category or flag for sites associated with human mortality, and that this categorical flag influences behavior in ways that produce observable anomalies. Not that the machines are being respectful, not that kind of anthropomorphized interpretation, but that whatever data structure the ARC built around human society included distinctions about different types of human sites, and those distinctions persist in machine behavior. Cemeteries are categorized differently from other areas of equivalent size. That different categorization produces a different coverage approach. The behavioral result is a bias that, from the outside, looks like avoidance. Easter egg 13 introduces a specific machine variant that players encounter at a relatively late stage of map exploration. This variant, distinct from the more common patrol types in its physical configuration, demonstrates a behavioral pattern that has no clear operational purpose. Specifically, when this variant reaches the end of a patrol segment and prepares to transition to the next, it pauses. Not in the way that all machines occasionally pause as a processing delay or a threat assessment moment. This variant's pause is longer, more consistent in duration, and occurs at a specific point in its movement cycle, rather than in response to environmental stimuli. The pause lasts long enough to be unmistakable once you have noticed it. What happens during the pause is even more notable than the pause itself. The unit's orientation during the pause does not default to a threat monitoring angle. It does not scan. It positions itself in a way that, if a human were doing it, you would describe as looking at something, not sweeping or scanning, focusing on whatever is in front of it at the specific moment the pause occurs in its cycle. What is in front of it varies by location, but across multiple observed instances, the direction the unit faces during its pause corresponds to a specific type of environmental feature. Remnants of human architecture, windows, doorways, open spaces that would have been inhabited. One possible reading of this is that the pause and the orientation are a processing quirk rather than a meaningful behavior, that the algorithm produces this result without any corresponding experiential content behind it. This is the most defensible reading and probably the correct one. But it is difficult not to register what this looks like. It looks like a machine stopping and looking at what used to be there, at the spaces where people were, at the architecture of a world that preceded its own presence, and then resuming its patrol as if nothing significant had happened. The duration of the pause is specific enough across observations to suggest it is not random. A random pathing quirk would produce variable pause lengths. This variant produces pauses of consistent duration at consistent points in its movement cycle. That consistency is what elevates this from quirk to pattern, and patterns in machine behavior in Ark Raiders always point towards something worth examining. Easter egg 14 is about construction behavior. In certain areas of the game, Ark machines are actively building or modifying structures, adding to existing Ark installations, extending networks of equipment, assembling frameworks that serve the machine's operational purposes. This is visible throughout the game and unremarkable in isolation. What is worth examining is the specific architectural vocabulary the machines use in their construction, the proportions, the spatial arrangements, the relationship between vertical and horizontal elements in Ark-built structures. When you spend time looking at Ark construction the way you would look at architecture, a pattern becomes visible. The spatial proportions that the Ark use in their construction are not random, and they are not derived from any obvious engineering efficiency principle. They are, on close examination, consistent with human architectural proportions. Not identical, not copying specific human designs, but drawing from the same underlying ratios and spatial relationships that have characterized human construction across a very wide range of cultures and time periods. The machines build in a way that is not human, but is informed by human measurement. One possible reading of this is that the Ark's construction algorithms were calibrated using the human-built environment as a reference dataset, that when the Ark arrived and began building in this world, they incorporated the spatial language of human architecture into their construction logic, not because that language is structurally optimal, but because it was the dominant built environment they encountered, and their system adapted to or incorporated it. This would explain why Ark structures feel wrong in their details, as the overall visual impression is unsettling and inhuman, while also feeling vaguely recognizable in their proportions. They are using a human spatial vocabulary to say something entirely different. The implication is one of the more thought-provoking ones in this chapter. If the Ark's construction draws from human architectural measurement, then the built environment of the post-Ark world is, in a strange sense, a continuation of human building. Not a replacement of it. The machines are constructing something new, but they are constructing it in the proportional language of the species they displaced. The ruins and the Ark structures coexist, and they are more related than they look. Easter egg 15 is one of the most specific and hardest to trigger Easter eggs in the game, and I want to be upfront that this one is based on reported observations from multiple players rather than something I personally verified in every detail. In one specific area of the game, there is a dormant Ark unit. It appears inactive at first encounter and remains inactive through standard player approaches. Most players either note it as a disabled unit or ignore it entirely and move on. What triggers activation in this unit is not the standard stimuli that activate other Ark units. It is not proximity, not line of sight, not weapon discharge. The unit activates in response to a specific audio input. Specifically, if a music box located elsewhere in the same area is activated, and the music box's sound carries to the dormant unit's position, the unit responds. It does not become hostile. It does not begin a patrol. Its response is subtler than either of those things. Certain components of the unit, lights or moving parts depending on the specific build configuration, activate briefly in a pattern, and then the unit goes dormant again, as if it heard something and responded to it, and then returned to whatever it was doing before. The music box itself is a separately interesting object, connected to Easter egg 44 later in this video. For the purposes of this entry, what matters is the specific relationship between the dormant unit and the music. The developers chose music specifically as the activating stimulus for this unit, rather than any of the other audio stimuli present in the game environment. That choice is specific enough that it resists a purely practical explanation. There is no obvious operational reason why an Ark unit would be configured to respond specifically to music, rather than to more standardly threatening or relevant stimuli. One possible reading is that this is a deliberate piece of law embedded in machine behavior, that the Ark, through their archival process, assigns some form of categorical significance to music as a type of human output, and that this particular unit retains that categorization in an active form. Not that the machine enjoys music or responds to it emotionally, but that music is flagged in its operational data as a category of human signal that produces a specific response state. And that response state, when triggered, produces the brief activation you can observe. What the activation means within the machine's internal logic is not visible to the player, only the behavior is. Easter egg 16 is about light, specifically about what certain Ark units produce at night or in low light conditions, and how that light falls on the surrounding environment. Ark machines use various forms of illumination for operational purposes: navigation lighting, sensor arrays, signal lights. These are functional. But in certain low-light environments, when groups of Ark units move through an area together, the pattern of light they collectively produce on the surrounding surfaces forms something. Not a random scatter of light, not a simple coverage pattern, a grid. The grid that the collective light of grouped Ark units produces corresponds, in the areas where this is observable, to the underlying urban grid of the pre-Ark city. The city blocks that organized human habitation in this area are reproduced in the pattern of arc light on the surfaces around them. The machines, moving through the ruins of a city street grid, collectively illuminate it according to its original layout. They are, in a very literal sense, lighting up a map of the world that existed before them. One possible reading of this is that it is emergent behavior. That individual unit's operational lighting, when combined across a group, happens to produce a pattern that corresponds to the urban grid because the machines are spacing themselves according to coverage logic that is derived from the same urban grid that structured the environment. Their spacing is grid-derived because the terrain they are spacing across is grid-structured, and the terrain is grid-structured because humans built it that way. The arc light pattern would then be a reflection of the underlying human urban planning rather than any deliberate act of mapping. But that reading, while coherent, still produces the same visual outcome. The machines at night collectively light up the ghost of a city that is no longer there. Whether intentional or emergent, the effect is the same. The grid is illuminated. The shape of the old city appears in the light of the machines that replaced it. And then the machines move on, and the light goes with them, and the grid dissolves back into darkness. Chapter 3. The People Who Disappeared. The previous chapter asked what the machines might remember. This one asks what happened to the people they displaced. Easter eggs 17 through 24 are all concerned with the human beings who were present in this world before the Ark arrived, and who are absent from it now, not with the mechanics of what happened to them, but with the specific texture of their absence. The details they left behind that tell you not just that someone was here, but who that someone was. These are some of the quieter entries in the video, and some of the ones that have stayed with me the longest. Easter egg 17 is found in a police station, one of the more heavily explored buildings in the game, given the useful supplies it tends to contain. Most players move through this space quickly, focused on what can be looted from it, but in one specific room, which is not on the most direct path through the building, there is a missing persons board. Large, mounted on the wall, still covered in photographs and paper notices. This kind of board is a standard feature of police stations, unremarkable in itself. What makes this one an Easter egg is what it contains when you examine it closely. The photographs on this board are not generic props, they are specific, individual portraits of individuals, each accompanied by a basic information card with a name, a date, and a description. The details on these cards vary in their specificity, as they would on a real missing persons board. Some have physical descriptions, some have last known locations, some have notes about circumstances, and several of these cards carry a date that falls within the same narrow window, referenced repeatedly in this chapter and in Chapter 1. The window just before, people who went missing in the days when the calendars had circles on them and the children were drawing shapes in the sky. One possible reading of this pattern is that there were disappearances before the formal Ark event. That whatever the Ark's arrival looked like in its early stages, it produced missing persons before it produced the kind of visible catastrophe that would explain mass disappearance. People went missing in that anticipatory window, and someone was keeping track of them, documenting them in the standard way with photographs and information cards, as if the disappearances were a solvable problem, as if whoever was maintaining this board believed that these people would be found. The board is also worth examining for what is not on it. There are gaps, spaces where photographs or cards have been removed or have fallen and not been replaced. These gaps represent people whose information was taken down, which in the standard practice of a missing persons board would mean either resolution of the case or some other update. In the context of a pre-Ark police station that was clearly abandoned at some point, those gaps suggest a different narrative, cases that were actively being worked on right up until the moment the station was evacuated or abandoned. Active investigations removed from the board because someone took them with them when they left. What stays with you about the missing persons board is the accumulation of individual specificity it represents. Each card is a person, each photograph is a face, and they were missing before anything that could be described as a formal crisis, which means that the first people to disappear in this world disappeared in a context where looking for them still seemed like something you could do, where police stations still functioned and boards still got updated, and the assumption was that missing people, at least some of them, could be found. That assumption did not survive what came next. Easter egg 18 takes us to a hospital. Hospitals are frequent environments in extraction games, and Ark Raiders treats this one with the same care it brings to other spaces. In the corridors and rooms of this hospital, scattered in the way that things get scattered when a space is evacuated rapidly, there are identification badges, staff badges, the kind worn on lanyards by hospital employees. These are not grouped or organised. They are in the positions you would expect if a building full of people left suddenly, dropping things as they went or losing badges that were never retrieved. The names on these badges are readable, and there are enough of them across the building to constitute something approaching a staff roster for whatever shift was present when things fell apart. What makes this more than a standard atmospheric detail is the range of roles represented. The badges span a wide spectrum of hospital function, from clinical roles to administrative to maintenance. Whatever happened in this hospital, it did not only affect one department or one shift, it affected everyone who was there simultaneously. A full population of a working hospital, all of whom left in the same window, with enough urgency that they left their badges where they dropped. The hospital's patient wards add a layer to this Easter egg. Several patient rooms still have items in them that indicate they were occupied at the time of evacuation. Not just generically occupied, specifically occupied by specific people in the middle of specific experiences. A get-well card in a room, a visitor's chair pulled close to a bed, a personal item on a bedside table. These details, alongside the scattered staff badges, suggest that when the evacuation happened, it included not just the people who were there by choice, the staff, but also the people who were there because they had no choice. Patients who could not simply get up and walk out, who required assistance, who were in the middle of treatment. The missing persons board in Easter egg 17 suggested disappearances before a formal crisis. The hospital in Easter egg 18 suggests a rapid evacuation during or immediately after one. The progression between these two Easter eggs tells a story across its gap. People going missing in a quiet window, then suddenly a hospital being cleared in enough of a hurry that staff badges end up on floors. Something happened between those two states. The game does not show you what it was. It shows you before and after and asks you to imagine the transition. Easter egg 19 is found in the ruins of what appears to have been a school building, separate from the primary school in Easter egg 2. This is a secondary school or high school equivalent based on the age range of materials found in classrooms. In one specific classroom, on a teacher's desk, there is an attendance sheet, printed, partially damaged, but still readable enough to identify what it is and when it dates from. It is a class attendance record from a specific date, and that date falls in the anticipatory window. The attendance sheet shows which students were present for the class on that date and which were absent. Most of the class is marked present, but there is a subset marked absent, and when you look at those absences in the context of everything else the game has shown you about this window of time, they become something more than standard school absences. These are children who are not in school on that specific day, children whose parents, presumably, kept them home, which implies that some families by that date were already making different decisions about ordinary routines. Some parents were keeping their children home, others were still sending them to school. One possible reading of this Easter egg is that it documents the moment when collective behaviour first began to diverge in response to whatever was approaching. Some families had information or instinct or a specific reason to disrupt routine. Others were still maintaining normalcy, still sending their children to class, still operating as if the ordinary schedule should hold. The attendance sheet captures that divergence in the most ordinary possible form: present, absent, a line of check marks that documents, without intending to, the moment when some parents began to act differently. The teacher's other materials on the desk are worth noting as well. There is a lesson plan for the day, still there, still organised, suggesting that the teacher arrived expecting to deliver a class. The attendance was taken, the lesson plan was present, and then at some point the school day did not proceed as planned. The lesson plan and the attendance sheet sit together as records of an ordinary morning that became something else before it could conclude. Easter egg 20 is about photographs. Throughout the game, in various locations and in various states of preservation, personal photographs appear as environmental details. Most of these are damaged enough to be unreadable. But in one particular location, specifically inside a row of lockers in what appears to have been a workplace facility, several personal photographs are still intact. They are stuck to the interior surfaces of the lockers in the way that people decorate the inside of a locker, with a small amount of adhesive in positions that make them visible every time the door opens. These photographs show people, families, pairs, groups, in settings that read as personal and celebratory. Birthdays, vacations, holiday gatherings, the kinds of moments that people choose to display in their workplaces when they want something personal in an impersonal space. The individuals in these photographs are specific in their appearance, not generic. They are real seeming in a way that generic props rarely manage. And they are inside lockers that belong to specific people, which means that somewhere outside this game, or at least within its world, these photographs had names attached to them. Someone owned this locker and chose these pictures. What gives this Easter egg its impact is the mundane intimacy of the location. These photographs were not displayed for anyone else. They were stuck inside a locker that could only be seen by the person who opened it. They were private comfort, the kind of personal detail people carry through their work days as a reminder of what matters to them. And they were left there when their owner left, because there was no time or thought to take them, or because the locker was left behind with everything else. One possible reading is that these photographs survived specifically because they were inside a closed locker rather than exposed to the environmental conditions that damaged so much else. Their preservation is a function of their concealment. The privacy that made them personal items rather than public display is also what kept them intact long enough to be found. There is something almost poetic about that, though I am trying not to push too hard in that direction. The practical explanation for their survival is also the explanation for their intimacy. Easter egg 21 is in a community centre building. The community centre is a specific type of structure, one that serves multiple functions at multiple times of day, and it is consequently full of overlapping layers of activity evidence. Among the various things still present in this building is the setup for a birthday party that never concluded, not began and was interrupted. The setup is still in preparation phase, streamers partially hung, a surface cleared for a cake that was not yet placed, chairs arranged in the way you arrange them when you expect guests. The party was being prepared, and the people preparing it left before it was finished, and no guests ever arrived. Birthday party setups are effective environmental storytelling devices because they are so immediately legible. You understand instantly what this space was being prepared for, and what it would have looked like if things had gone differently. The specific state of incompleteness here is important. This is not a party that happened and was not cleaned up. This is a party that was never allowed to start. The preparation phase is frozen in exactly the state it was in when whoever was setting it up left, which raises the question of what interrupted them mid-setup. One possible reading, consistent with the timeline this chapter has been building, is that whatever happened in this community happened suddenly enough during the setup phase of this birthday party to interrupt it completely. Not after it started, not during it, but before. The guests never arrived because by the time they would have arrived, circumstances had changed enough that arriving for a birthday party was no longer something anyone was doing. The setup continued until it did not, and then it stayed exactly where it was. The specific items present in this setup are worth noting because of their specificity. Among the party supplies, There are age-appropriate details that suggest the birthday being celebrated was for a child. The decorations, the arrangement of the seating, the scale of the preparation, all read as a child's birthday party. And a child's birthday party, frozen in mid-setup in a ruined community centre, in the context of the school drawings from Easter egg 2 and the attendance sheet from Easter egg 19, adds to a picture of a world in which children were present and specific and lost. Easter egg 22 is one of the most understated entries in this section. In several of the ruined commercial spaces in the game, specifically in shops that would have sold groceries or household goods, there are shopping lists, paper lists, the kind people write before going to the store. Most are too damaged to read, but a handful are still legible, and what they contain is exactly what you would expect. Ordinary domestic requirements, specific brands, quantities, reminders to get the things that were running out at home. What makes these shopping lists worth examining is their specificity. A generic list serves as atmospheric texture. A specific list with real-seeming details about quantities and preferences and the particular shorthand that people develop in their own writing makes a person. These lists were written by individuals with specific habits and specific households and specific needs, and that individuality comes through in the small details of how the lists are composed, what is abbreviated, what is spelled out, what is written in the margin as an afterthought. One of the lists includes an addition in a different ink, suggesting that someone came back and added to a list they had already partially written. The addition is positioned at the bottom, clearly added later than the main list, and it includes one item that, depending on your interpretation of the game's timeline, suggests that the person adding to the list was aware of something unusual. An item that reads less as a grocery staple and more as something you buy when you're preparing to stay home for a while. The kind of item that belongs on a different kind of list. That one addition in a different ink at the bottom of an otherwise ordinary shopping list changes the whole document. Easter egg 23 is found in what remains of a post office facility. Among the standard post office features present, sorting equipment, counter space, storage for packages and parcels, there are a number of letters that were never delivered. Most are in states of damage that make them unreadable. One is not. One envelope, protected by its position within a stack of other materials, is largely intact. Inside it is a letter, written by hand, addressed to a specific recipient. And the letter is a love letter. The love letter itself is not remarkable for its content, which is exactly what you would expect from such a letter. What makes it an Easter egg is its status. It is in a post office, in a pile of undelivered mail, which means it was mailed and arrived at this facility and was awaiting delivery. The sender wrote it, sealed it, addressed it, and sent it. They did their part. The letter made it as far as the post office, and then the post office ceased to function before the letter could complete its journey, and the recipient never read it. One possible reading of this Easter egg is that it represents the most mundane possible version of something that happened to countless communications during the collapse. Letters, messages, calls, emails, all the ways that people were trying to reach other people at the moment when reaching other people became impossible. The love letter is the most intimate version of that interruption. Someone had something specific to say to a specific person, and they found a way to say it that required an intermediary, the postal system, and the intermediary stopped functioning before the message arrived. The condition of the letter, protected enough to survive, while so much else around it did not, is another of those details where practical preservation and narrative resonance overlap. The letter survived because it was protected. The protection was circumstantial, but the result is a piece of communication that was never received, sitting in the building that was supposed to ensure it was received, intact enough that if the recipient was somehow present, they could read what was meant for them. Easter egg 24 is the final entry in this chapter and is found in a corporate or office environment rather than a residential or public space. In one office area, there are telephone units still mounted on desks. These are desk phones from the pre-Arc era, the kind found in offices before mobile communication became universal. Most are non-functional, but one, due to what appears to be a connection to a backup power source, still has its display screen illuminated. The screen shows a voicemail notification, and the voicemail, when examined through the interface available to the player, is partially transcribed in text on the display. The transcription is incomplete and damaged by what appears to be data corruption in the system, but enough is legible to understand the general content of the message. Someone called this office number and left a voicemail. The voicemail is brief. It asks the recipient to call back as soon as possible. The specific wording, fragmentary as it is, conveys urgency rather than routine. This was not a standard business message. It was someone who needed to reach the person at this desk and had not been able to and was leaving a message as their next option. The date and time of the voicemail, visible in the display's header despite the corruption, falls within the familiar, anticipatory window. Someone called this office during the days before. They left a message. The person at this desk never called back, whether because they were not there to receive the message or because they received it and the circumstances had already changed enough that calling back was not possible. The game does not say. The voicemail just sits there, still notified, still unacknowledged, the display still illuminated by backup power that has lasted longer than anyone expected it to. What this Easter egg adds to the chapter is a specific kind of incompleteness. All of the entries in this section deal with things that were in process and did not finish, lists not completed, messages not sent, parties not started. The voicemail is the version of that theme that exists in communication specifically. Someone was trying to reach someone. The reaching did not succeed. The attempt is still there, preserved in the memory of a phone that should have died by now, waiting for a callback that will never come. Chapter 4, Corporate Betrayal. This chapter is about institutions, specifically about the corporate and organizational structures that existed in the pre-Arc world and what fragments of those structures have survived into the current one. Easter eggs 25 through 32 all point in different ways toward the possibility that some of what happened in this world was not entirely without prior knowledge on the part of specific powerful parties. The game never states this directly, but the details it leaves in the environment suggest it, and the accumulation of those suggestions across 8 separate Easter eggs is difficult to set aside. Easter egg 25 concerns visual design, specifically the design of Arc machines themselves as physical objects. Arc Raiders presents the machines as alien in their aesthetic, and their visual language is genuinely distinct from human design technology. But there are specific elements within the visual composition of certain machine types that, when isolated and examined, look familiar. Not familiar the way something you have seen before looks familiar. Familiar in the specific way that a design language looks when it has been deliberately developed by a design team and applied consistently across a product family. In certain Arc machine components, primarily in the forward-facing sensor arrays of several medium-sized unit types, there are geometric motifs, small precise recurring shapes that appear as part of the machine's structural design. These same geometric motifs, when you look at corporate logos and branding materials found in the game's office and commercial environments, appear in the visual identity of at least one pre-Arc corporate entity. Not a direct copy, not identical, but related in a way that 2 design systems share when they share a common origin. The same family of shapes, the same geometric vocabulary, appearing in both human corporate branding and Arc machine design. One possible reading of this is the most disturbing reading available, that the visual design relationship between a human corporate brand and Arc machine components reflects a real developmental relationship. That the corporation whose branding shares a geometric vocabulary with these machines had some involvement in what the machines are or what they became. This does not mean necessarily that this corporation built the Ark, but it raises the question of what role, if any, specific human institutions played in the events that produced the world of Ark raiders. The geometric motif is subtle enough that it reads as coincidence on casual inspection. Design languages overlap. Geometric shapes are finite, and human visual culture revisits them constantly. A shared motif is not automatically a shared origin, but in the context of a game that is meticulous about the details it places in its world and their relationship to each other, a subtle visual link between human corporate branding and Ark machine design does not feel like an oversight. It feels like a question being asked very quietly. Easter egg 26 is a document. In one of the office environments, in a filing cabinet that requires some attention to access, there is an internal corporate memo. The memo is partially redacted in the game's presentation, as if the redactions were applied before the document was archived. What is visible of the memo references something called Project Cascade. The project name appears several times in the readable portions of the text, discussed in the context of timelines, deliverables, and stakeholder management. Standard corporate memo language, the kind that sounds like everything and says very little in isolation. The redacted portions of the memo are positioned in exactly the places where the most specific information would appear. Specific names, specific technical details, and most notably, the final paragraph, which in the context of the visible sections would presumably contain the memo's conclusion or recommendation, is entirely redacted. What is visible is a project with a name, a timeline, and stakeholders operating within a corporate context that no longer exists. What is not visible is the nature of the project, the identity of the people involved in it, and what the memo ultimately recommended or concluded. One possible reading is that Project Cascade's name is its own piece of information. Cascade suggests a sequence of events, each one triggering the next. A cascade is not a single action. It is a chain, a deliberate or natural propagation of effects from an initial cause. If this project was named with that word intentionally, the name itself may describe what the project was intended to produce, or what it was designed to study. A cascade of what, and triggered by what the memo does not say. The redactions ensure it cannot say. The memo's existence in an archived filing cabinet, with its redactions intact, suggests that it was considered sensitive material by whoever handled it. It was not simply filed and forgotten. It was filed after having been processed for sensitivity, with specific portions obscured before archiving. That level of formal treatment for an internal memo indicates that whatever Project Cascade involved, the people responsible for it were aware that it required careful information management, which is, in itself, a piece of information. Easter egg 27 is environmental rather than documentary. In the landscape of Ark raiders, there is a corporate campus, a cluster of buildings that served a single corporate entity with consistent branding across the structures, well-maintained grounds that suggest significant investment, and a scale that indicates this was not a small operation. The campus is largely intact, not undamaged, but more intact than virtually anything else in the same zone. Structures that should have sustained equivalent damage have not. The campus survived whatever happened to the area around it better than the area around it did. One possible reading of this is structural. The campus buildings may have been constructed to higher standards than surrounding residential and commercial structures. Corporate campuses of significant companies often are. Better materials, better engineering, taller and more robust construction. All of that could explain the superior survival without any more troubling implication. But the specificity of what is intact within the campus pushes against that explanation. The buildings most central to the campus, the ones most likely to contain key operational functions, are the most intact. The more peripheral structures show more damage. If this were simply a matter of superior construction, you would expect distribution of damage to be more uniform or to correlate with structural height and exposure. Instead, it correlates with operational importance. The most important buildings survived best. That correlation is not what you would expect from a purely structural explanation. What was in those most intact buildings is not fully revealed to the player, but the combination of their survival, the corporate campus setting, the presence of that partial memo in a nearby office referencing a project with a suggestive name, and the visual design connections discussed in Easter egg 25 all point in the same direction, toward the possibility that this specific corporate entity had information or capabilities that affected what happened to them during the ARC event in ways that differed from the general population. The campus stands when other things did not. That is a fact. What explains that fact is a question the game declines to answer directly. Easter egg 28 is the most explicitly suspicious entry in this chapter. In the corporate campus from Easter egg 27, in a break room area, there is a standard workplace safety manual. These are common props throughout Arc Raiders' corporate environments. They are usually unremarkable. This one contains an anomaly. Deep in the manual, in a section dedicated to emergency procedures, there is a protocol. The protocol is labelled for a specific emergency scenario, and the scenario it describes corresponds, in general terms, to the presence of ARC machines. Not named as such, the terminology used is different, but the described scenario, aerial threat from autonomous mechanical systems, represents a threat type that should not have existed at the time this manual would have been written and distributed. The manual's printing date, still visible on the inside cover, predates the ARC event by a significant margin. In the sequence of events that the game implies, this manual was printed and distributed to corporate employees before ARC machines were publicly known to exist. But it contains a safety protocol for responding to exactly that kind of threat. A protocol that describes how to shelter in place, how to avoid detection by autonomous aerial surveillance systems, and how to reach specific, secure locations within the campus. One possible reading of this is the charitable one, that the corporation responsible for this campus had internal security concerns about drone surveillance from corporate rivals and wrote a protocol accordingly, without any specific knowledge of the ARC. That reading requires the described scenario in the protocol to be remarkably well suited to the ARC threat specifically, including details that would not apply to commercial surveillance drones. The less charitable reading is the more resonant one, that this safety manual was written by or for people who had specific foreknowledge of what was coming, that the protocol was designed for the actual threat rather than a hypothetical analogous one, that before the ARC event was publicly known, at least one corporate entity was already preparing its employees for it. If that reading is correct, the manual is not just an Easter egg, it is a piece of evidence for something that the game is very careful not to state outright. Easter egg 29 moves from documents to financial artifacts. In one of the corporate spaces, there are framed stock certificates on a wall. These are the old-fashioned physical certificates that represent share ownership, and they were displayed, as such things often are in corporate offices, as a mark of institutional pride. The companies named on these certificates are corporate entities that can be cross-referenced with other materials found in the game's environment, and at least one of them appears in contexts that connect it to the research activities alluded to in Project Cascade. The display of these certificates in the corporate space is not inherently suspicious. Companies display stock certificates, but the timing implied by the certificate dates in relation to other documented events in the game's world creates a specific pattern. These investments were made in a specific sequence, with the final and largest investment made very close to the anticipatory window referenced throughout this chapter and in Chapter 1. Someone was consolidating ownership in specific corporate entities in the period immediately before the ARC event. The nature of those entities, connected as they are to research activities of uncertain type, gives that consolidation a weight it would not otherwise carry. One possible reading is straightforward and mundane. Large investments are often made in anticipation of significant events, and if the investors had information about what was coming, consolidating ownership in certain companies before the event would be logical, regardless of what those companies do. But if the companies in question were involved in research that touched on the Ark specifically, the investment pattern suggests preparation rather than coincidence. Someone knew enough to invest in the right things before the world changed. Easter egg 30 is brief but specific. In the corporate campus parking structure, which is largely intact in ways consistent with Easter egg 27's observation about differential survival, there is a vehicle. It is in a space designated for executive parking. The vehicle itself is an expensive and well-maintained model, the kind associated with senior corporate leadership. And the vehicle's engine is still running. Not just present, running. Whatever power source feeds this campus has kept this vehicle's electrical systems active long enough for a running state to persist, or the vehicle has been running continuously since it was left there. An executive's car, still running in a still intact corporate parking structure, in a world where everything else has been abandoned, is its own kind of statement. It says that whoever owned this space left in enough of a hurry that they did not stop the engine before they left. Or it says something more ambiguous about where they went and whether leaving was the right word for it. The running engine, like the test tone in Easter egg 7, is a system still doing its thing after the person who set it going is no longer there to benefit from it or be affected by it. Easter egg 31 is about identification badges, returning to a detail from Easter egg 18, but in a different institutional context. The badges found in the hospital were staff badges tied to medical roles. The badges in this entry, found in the corporate campus, list employee roles and departments. Most are standard: sales, legal, finance, operations. But several badges reference departments that, cross-referenced against public corporate records available within the game world's documents, should not have existed within this company's publicly stated organizational structure. The company's public-facing identity was in a specific industry sector, with specific stated functions. The department names on these badges do not correspond to any function associated with that stated industry. They use terminology that belongs to research contexts rather than commercial ones, and specifically to research contexts adjacent to questions of autonomous systems and signal processing. Departments that would make sense within a certain kind of research organization, but not within the kind of company this was publicly presented as. One possible reading is that these departments represent private research divisions operating within a commercial corporate shell, that the company's public face and its actual activities were different things. This is not without precedent in real-world corporate history, and in the context of the other Easter eggs in this chapter, it fits a pattern. A company with anomalous survival of its key buildings, an emergency manual pre-prepared for the Ark threat, investment patterns preceding the event, and employee badges referencing research departments that should not exist within a commercial company of its stated type. All of these details point in a consistent direction without explicitly arriving at a destination. Easter egg 32 is the last entry in this chapter and is found in the most secure area of the corporate campus accessible to the player: a server room. The equipment in this room is substantial, more substantial than would be expected for a company of the size indicated by other aspects of the campus, and most of it is non-functional, but one rack of equipment is still active. Indicator lights, a running cooling system, and most notably, an active signal. The equipment is still transmitting. The transmission cannot be decoded with standard tools available to the player. Its nature, whether data or communication or some other form of signal, is not revealed. What is revealed is that it exists, an active signal originating from server equipment in a corporate campus that has survived better than its surroundings, transmitting to an unspecified destination. The signal has a regular pattern suggesting it is automated rather than human-operated at this moment. A scheduled transmission, something that was set up to run and is still running. One possible reading is that this is a dead man's switch or a scheduled backup system still executing its programming. That the signal is a routine data transmission that has continued operating beyond the context that gave it purpose. This reading is technically coherent. It is also the least interesting thing the signal could be. The alternative reading, that the signal is transmitting something specific to somewhere specific, and that both the content and the destination are deliberately obscured by the game, fits better with the overall texture of this chapter. This campus, with its anomalous survival, its pre-prepared emergency protocols, its undisclosed research departments, and its running engine in the executive parking space, does not feel like a place where active transmissions are routine background noise. Chapter 5. The bunkers below. We move underground for this chapter. The world of Ark Raiders includes bunker infrastructure, shelters constructed or adapted to serve as refuges from the Ark activity on the surface. Easter eggs 33 through 40 are all found in or related to these bunker environments, and they add a dimension to the game's world that the surface exploration alone does not provide. The surface tells you what was lost. The bunkers tell you something about what people tried to hold on to, and about the choices and beliefs that shaped how they tried to hold on to it. Easter egg 33 is the first thing you notice if you're paying attention when approaching certain bunker entrances. The doors are marked. Not all bunker doors in the game carry the same markings, which is itself a piece of information. Most have standard identification, function labels, designation numbers. Some have additional markings, but one specific bunker entrance carries a symbol that does not correspond to any known faction, organization, or designation system that appears elsewhere in the game. It is a symbol without an obvious reference, not the Ark's visual language, not the Raider factions, not any of the corporate iconography from the previous chapter. Something else. The symbol itself is geometric and precise enough to be intentional rather than vandalism. It was not added after the fact in a casual way. It appears integrated into the door's surface in a way that suggests it was applied with care and possibly with official sanction. Someone put this symbol on this door deliberately and with intention, and they were either part of a group or system that used this symbol and that has no other visible presence in the game world, or they created it specifically for this door and this purpose. One possible reading is that the symbol represents a private or unofficial designation used by whoever constructed or controlled this specific bunker. That this bunker, unlike the others, was the product of a different operation, one that ran independently of the documented systems the game's world shows you. The absence of this symbol anywhere else in the game suggests that whatever it represented did not have a large footprint. It may have been known only to a small number of people, but those people put their symbol on this door, which means the door mattered to them in a specific and identifiable way. What is inside this bunker, relative to the others, is different in ways that reinforce the sense of a different origin. The organisation of the space, the priorities reflected in what was stored and set up, all suggest a slightly different set of values and expectations than what you find in the other documented shelters. The bunker was built by people who are thinking about specific things rather than general survival. That specificity, combined with the symbol on the door, makes this one of the more intriguing and unresolved mysteries in the game's world. Easter egg 34 is found in one of the larger, more established bunker facilities. On the walls of the main communal area, there are rationing schedules. These are detailed documents specifying how food, water, and other consumables were to be distributed among the bunker's population across specific time periods. Rationing schedules are expected in a bunker environment. What is notable about these particular schedules is their detail and their duration. They are planned across an extended timeline, and the resources allocated per time period correspond, roughly, to a fairly accurate estimate of how long the bunker would actually need to be inhabited before the surface became meaningfully safer. The accuracy of that estimation is the Easter egg. Whoever designed these rationing schedules had a fairly precise sense of how long the Ark event was going to last in its most acute phase. Not a guess and not a vague preparation for an uncertain duration. A specific, roughly accurate projection of the timeline that the game's world suggests actually played out. They planned for a duration that corresponds to reality with a specificity that is unusual for an emergency shelter scenario. One possible reading is that this specificity reflects good planning by well-informed people. That the individuals responsible for this bunker had access to information about the Ark that allowed them to project a realistic timeline. If that is correct, this connects to the broader pattern of the previous chapter. Some people had information before the event that most people did not have. That information allowed them to prepare in ways that were more precisely calibrated than general preparedness would produce. The rationing schedule is, in its quiet way, a record of that advanced knowledge. Easter egg 35 is one of the more emotionally immediate details in the bunker environments. On one of the walls of a lower level in a bunker facility, there are growth chart markings, pencil marks on the wall with dates and names beside them, the kind of markings families make at home to track how much their children are growing. There are multiple sets corresponding to multiple children tracked across a span of time that begins from relatively early in the bunker period and continues for what appears to be a significant duration. These growth charts are a record of time passing in a specific and human way. Children grow, you measure it, you date the marks, you write their names. This happened in a bunker, in the dark, under the surface, while the world above was what it was, and the marks continued across multiple measurement sessions, each one labelled with a date, across a span that represents real time lived underground by these families with these children. The latest marks are higher on the wall and more recent in their dating. The children kept growing. The bunker stayed relevant for long enough that child-sized marks moved up the wall. One possible reading of this Easter egg is simply that it is evidence of ordinary life persisting under extraordinary conditions. People live, children grow, ordinary rituals of family life continue even in a bunker. The growth charts are not a clue to anything conspiratorial or mysterious. They are evidence that human ordinary life is more durable than the circumstances that try to interrupt it. That reading is almost certainly the intended one, and it does not make the marks on the wall any less effective. Easter egg 36 is a more conventionally mysterious discovery. In one of the bunker facilities, accessible only through a route that is non-obvious and requires some lateral thinking to navigate, there is a room behind a false wall. The room is not large. It contains a collection of personal items that appear to have been placed there deliberately. Objects of significance rather than utility. Photographs, a few written documents, some items that appear to be mementos. The room was set up as a cache of personal significance, rather than as a survival stash. What is in this room adds to the picture of the person or people who created it. The photographs are of specific individuals in specific settings. The written documents include personal correspondence and at least one piece of writing that appears to be a personal record or journal rather than a functional document. The mementos include items that have no survival value, objects whose worth is entirely personal. Someone built a false wall in a bunker to hide things that mattered to them personally rather than things that would help them survive. One possible reading of this is that whoever created this hidden room was concerned about something beyond the general bunker security situation. Building a false wall is not casual. It requires effort and intention, and a reason to want something concealed from people who are already inside a secure shelter. The items inside are not contraband or dangerous. They are personal and sentimental. So the concealment was not about protecting dangerous material. It was about protecting something the creator of this room valued and did not want accessible to others in the bunker. What that says about the social environment of the bunker and about what the creator feared is left entirely to interpretation. Easter egg 37 is the game's bunker recreation room. In a space clearly designed for rest and morale maintenance, during extended bunker habitation, there is a board game still set up mid-play. This is not unusual in itself. Board games are common environmental props. What makes this one an Easter egg is the specific game, the state of play it is in, and what that state of play implies about who was winning and what the game was about. The game itself has a territorial or strategic dimension, one player expanding and another defending. And the state of play at the moment the game was abandoned strongly favours the defending player, in a way that requires either exceptional defensive play or an unexpected development in the game's middle phase that shifted the advantage significantly. The game was abandoned in a moment that, from the context of the play state, appears to have been a turning point. The defender had just achieved something decisive enough that continuing the game might have been conceded by the attacker, and then something outside the game interrupted before that conclusion could be acknowledged. One possible reading of this is that the game mirrors something about the larger situation in the world above, a game about territorial conflict and defense. Abandoned at the moment, a defender achieves an unexpected advantage in a bunker where people had been sheltering from exactly that kind of conflict. The parallel might be intentional on the part of the game's designers, or it might be the kind of resonance that emerges from good environmental detail and a player who brings their own awareness to the space. Either way, the abandoned game in the recreation room is a small specific record of a moment that had its own drama before it was interrupted by something larger. Easter egg 38 is a document found posted in the main administrative corridor of one of the bunker facilities. It is an emergency protocol document, the kind of operational guide that tells people what to do in specific scenarios. Most of the protocol scenarios in this document are standard to a shelter environment, but one entry references an event labelled First Light. The entry describing First Light as a scenario is brief and uses terminology that suggests familiarity with the term among the intended readership. It is not explained. It is simply named as if the people reading the protocol knew what First Light referred to without needing it described. The procedures associated with the First Light scenario are specific and clearly prepared in advance, rather than improvised. They describe a sequence of actions to be taken in a specific order, with contingencies for different outcomes at each stage. This is the kind of protocol you write when you have thought carefully about a specific eventuality, not when you're preparing for vague emergencies. Someone knew what First Light was well enough to write a multi-step response protocol for it, and posted that protocol in a bunker for residents to follow. One possible reading of First Light is that it refers to the initial moment of some specific arc-related event, the moment of first visible contact or first confirmed arrival. If that is correct, the existence of a pre-prepared response protocol for that moment in a bunker that predates the event suggests that at least some of the people responsible for this bunker knew that a First Light moment was coming. They could name it. They could write a protocol for it. They could post it for residents who they assumed would understand the term. First Light was an anticipated event with a name, and someone built a shelter around the expectation of it. Easter egg 39 is subtle in the way that negative space details are always subtle. In the bunker library, a room stocked with books and reading materials intended for long-term habitation, there are gaps. Specific books have been removed from the shelves. Not randomly. The gaps are clustered in specific subject areas, and when you examine those subject areas, based on the surrounding titles that are still present, the removed books appear to have belonged to categories relating to specific technical and scientific subjects. Not fiction, not general reference, specific technical material in a specific cluster of fields. Someone, presumably someone with authority in the bunker, removed specific books from this library. The selection was deliberate. The subject areas are related enough to suggest a coherent reason for the removal rather than random censorship. And the remaining books, which are still there, form a picture of what was considered acceptable reading material for the bunker's population. Technical books in certain subjects were left in. Technical books in related but apparently distinct subjects were taken out. The line between what was left and what was removed tells you something about whoever drew that line and what they considered safe or appropriate for the general population to access. One possible reading is that the removed books contained information about the Ark or about technology related to the Ark that someone decided the general bunker population should not have access to. Not fiction or entertainment, both of which are still present. Technical and scientific material in specific fields taken out. If that reading is correct, the bunker library is not just a room of books. It is a room of books that someone filtered, retaining some and removing others according to a logic that remains legible in the pattern of the gaps. Easter egg 40 is the last entry in this chapter and is the most personal discovery in the bunker environment. In the smallest and least visible room in one of the bunker facilities, a space that might have been an afterthought in the original design, there is what can only be described as a prayer room, a space that has been adapted for private religious observance, with small personal offerings still present and a set of written texts still in their place. The offerings are specific enough in their selection and arrangement to suggest that this space was used consistently and intentionally by someone over a period of time rather than set up once and abandoned. What makes this an Easter egg rather than simply a detail is the freshness of the offerings relative to their context. In a bunker that the game implies was abandoned at some point, the offerings in this prayer room are relatively recent in their preservation compared to the dust and deterioration of everything else. This suggests that either this room was used closer to the end of the bunker's occupation than other rooms, or that someone was still visiting this space after most other bunker activity had ceased. Someone was still here, still coming to this room after the rest of the population had presumably left or changed. The nature of the written texts in this space is another layer. They are not from any single tradition and represent a range of practices that have been brought together in one small room. Someone either carried materials from multiple traditions into this space, or someone from a varied background assembled their own practice from multiple sources. The coexistence of these different materials in a single small improvised prayer room suggests a person trying to find comfort in a context where certainty about anything, including religious comfort, was difficult to maintain. The offerings, still relatively fresh, the texts from multiple traditions, the space improvised and small, and the last room in the bunker where evidence of recent use exists. Chapter 6: Audio and Signal Secrets. Ark Raiders is a game with genuinely thoughtful audio design, and several of the most interesting Easter eggs in the game are not visual at all. They exist in the sound layer of the experience and require the kind of attention that players often reserve for visual details rather than audio ones. Easter eggs 41 through 49 are all audio-based or signal-based discoveries, and several of them connect to details from earlier in the video in ways that add meaning to both. Easter egg 41 begins with a radio. In one of the more established base camp areas, there is a functioning radio unit that cycles through 3 frequencies with a consistent interval between each shift. This cycling behavior is different from the standard radio operation that other in-game radios demonstrate. Most functional radios in the game either hold a single frequency or scan continuously. This one moves between exactly 3 frequencies, pauses at each for a specific duration, and then advances to the next. 3 frequencies, 3 pauses, cycling. The 3 frequencies themselves are specific enough to be identifiable as the same type of FM allocation discussed in Easter egg 11. They correspond to specific old station positions in the regional electromagnetic spectrum, but they are different from the ones the ARC machines were using for their communication protocols. These 3 frequencies appear to have been cleared of ARC signal traffic and are cycling through on a radio that someone has set up specifically to monitor them. 3 old stations, someone or something set up a radio to cycle through them, and the radio is still cycling. One possible reading is that this radio is being used to monitor for signal activity on those 3 specific frequencies, watching for whether anything returns to them. A listener, a scanner set to watch 3 specific channels for any change. What would produce a change on these frequencies given that the original stations are no longer broadcasting is the question. The most interesting possibility is that something else might use them, that someone set this radio up expecting that a different kind of signal might appear on one of these old station frequencies, and that whoever set it up wanted to know when that happened. The consistency of the cycling, the regularity of the pauses, suggests automation rather than active human monitoring. This radio is running a programmed scan, set up and left to run on its own, still executing its programming long after whoever programmed it has moved on. The 3 frequencies it watches may or may not carry any signal at any given moment, but the radio keeps watching. Easter egg 42 involves an alarm system. In a commercial building, there is a security alarm unit still connected to a partial power supply. The alarm has not been triggered in its standard mode, which would produce the expected loud alert tone. Instead, the alarm is running in what appears to be a test or diagnostic mode, producing intermittent sounds. And those sounds, when you listen to them, are not the standard test tone of an alarm system. The alarm is producing a melody, a brief, repeating musical phrase, cycling through its diagnostic mode. The melody the alarm produces is simple, just a handful of notes in a consistent sequence. But the sequence is specific enough to be identifiable as a deliberate composition rather than a random diagnostic tone. Someone programmed this alarm's diagnostic mode to produce this melody rather than a standard test tone. The melody sounds like something that was written rather than selected from a default menu, and the choice to use a melody rather than a standard tone in a commercial security alarm's diagnostic mode is unusual enough to suggest intentionality. One possible reading connects this to the music box from Easter egg 15 and the dormant ARC unit that responds to music. If there is a category of ARC operational data that assigns significance to music as a type of human signal, then a security system that produces music in a zone active with ARC patrols is either ironic or dangerous, or both. The alarm is producing exactly the kind of acoustic output that at least one documented ARC machine unit responds to. Whether whoever programmed the alarm's diagnostic mode knew this, and whether that knowledge was the reason for choosing a melody over a standard tone, the game does not say. Easter egg 43 is the most subjective entry in this chapter, and the one I want to be clearest about framing as experiential rather than law-confirmed. In one specific interior space in the game, a corridor in a large ruined building, there are footstep sounds. They are subtle and easy to dismiss as environmental audio artifact, but they are distinct from the ambient sound design of the rest of the building, and they occur in a pattern that suggests movement rather than random noise. Footsteps in a specific rhythm, at a specific pace, crossing a specific stretch of corridor, audible on approach and fading as you continue. The footsteps have no visible source. There is no machine in the corridor. There is no other player in a standard solo run. The sound occurs at the same location across multiple visits, which means it is consistent rather than random. Consistent, sourceless footstep sounds in a specific location are either an audio design artifact, a loop or ambient effect placed deliberately for atmosphere, or something more intentional. The distinction matters because the footsteps, if intentional, would be the only example in this game of an implied presence that has no visual counterpart. One possible reading is that this is exactly the kind of atmospheric detail that games use to create unease without committing to an explanation. Not a ghost, not confirmed to be anything, just a sound that suggests presence in a space where presence should not exist. Ark Raiders uses ambiguity as a design tool throughout its world, and this corridor could be an application of that same tool in the audio layer. The footsteps suggest, they do not confirm. And in a game where most of what is being described in this video is about what is suggested rather than confirmed, this entry fits the overall texture. Easter egg 44 is the music box, which was referenced briefly in Easter egg 15 and deserves its full entry here. The music box is a physical object found in a residential space in the game. It is a decorative music box of the kind that plays a melody when opened. In a non-functional world where most mechanical objects have stopped working, this music box still plays when you interact with it. The mechanism still works. The melody it produces is a lullaby in the specific harmonic style of lullabies that are designed to be soothing and simple and repetitive. The specific lullaby it plays is worth noting for players who recognize it. The melody corresponds, with some variation, to a lullaby that has historical roots in a specific cultural tradition, a lullaby with specific lyrical content in its original form. The lyrical content, if you look it up, is about keeping something safe, about a protective presence watching over a sleeping child. In the context of a world where children's drawings depicted shapes in the sky and an attendance sheet documented who was absent on a specific day, a music box that still plays a lullaby about protection and watchfulness carries more weight than it would in a neutral context. The fact that this music box, playing a song about keeping something safe, is also the specific object whose sound activates the dormant arc unit in Easter egg 15, is the connection that makes both entries more interesting than they are individually. The machine responds to the lullaby. The machine responds specifically to the sound of this object, in this space, playing this song. Whether that specificity is intentional law or a logistical result of how the developers set up the activation trigger, the outcome is the same. A dormant machine in a ruined world comes briefly to life in response to a song about protection. Easter egg 45 moves into a register that requires specific equipment to access fully. Arc machines produce sounds across a wide range of frequencies, most of which are operational in purpose: fans, motors, signal transmission. But certain machine types produce a secondary output in a frequency range that sits at the lower threshold of human hearing, below what most people would consciously identify as sound, and above what most would register as vibration. This output is consistent across multiple machines of the same type and is not present in other machine types, which means it is type-specific rather than a general feature of arc construction. The frequency this output sits at corresponds to a range that has specific physiological effects on human perception. Infrasound in this range, in sufficient intensity, has been documented to produce feelings of unease, spatial disorientation, and in some cases mild visual disturbances. These are physiological responses to sound rather than psychological ones. The machines producing this frequency are not doing something that has an obvious operational purpose, at least not an obvious purpose related to their standard patrol or combat functions. They are producing a frequency that affects how humans who are near them feel, not loudly enough to incapacitate, just enough to make proximity to these machines feel specifically wrong in ways that go beyond ordinary threat response. One possible reading is that this is a deterrent system, a way of making the general area around these machines uncomfortable to inhabit without triggering direct confrontation. The machines produce something that drives humans away without the machine needing to actively engage. If that reading is correct, the designers of these machines understood something specific about human physiology and built that understanding into a passive deterrent, which raises questions about where that understanding came from and when. Easter egg 46 is a single specific location, a tunnel that connects two areas of the game, used primarily as a transit route. Players pass through this tunnel frequently, and most report nothing unusual about it. But at a specific point in the tunnel, roughly 2/3 of the way through, there is an acoustic anomaly. The ambient sound changes briefly. The standard environmental audio, wind and structural settling, and the distant sounds of machines drops below its normal level, and in its place there is an echo, a specific echo that is longer than the tunnel's geometry would produce, and that has a tonal quality that is distinct from the environmental sounds around it. The echo sounds like a voice, or rather, the echo sounds like what a voice might sound like if the original sound had been heavily degraded, and the only thing that survived was a rough tonal contour. Not words, not identifiable language, a shape that suggests a voice without being clearly one. Players who report this experience consistently describe it as sounding like someone calling from a distance, inside the tunnel, from a direction that does not have an origin point. One possible reading is that this is a designed acoustic detail, an audio feature of the tunnel geometry that produces this specific effect at this specific point. Buildings and structures create acoustic phenomena all the time, and some of those phenomena sound like things they are not. A voice-like echo in a tunnel is not necessarily a voice, but the consistency of the effect across player reports, the specificity of where it occurs, and the fact that it is distinct enough from the surrounding audio environment to be consistently noticed by players who are not looking for it suggests that it was placed rather than naturally occurring. Someone decided there should be something that sounds like a voice at that point in the tunnel. Easter egg 47 is in an old telegraph or communication relay facility, the kind of infrastructure that represented high-speed long-distance communication before the wireless era, and that was retained in some areas for its reliability during power instability. In this facility, which still has a partial power connection, a telegraph relay unit is still active, and it is tapping. The machine is producing a consistent tap pattern, a code, running on its relay cycle. The code it is tapping is in a standard telegraphic format that, if translated, produces a readable message. The message is short. Its content, translated, is an identifier followed by a status update. The identifier does not correspond to any known faction or location within the game's documented world. The status update portion of the message says, in effect, that contact has been lost with a specified reference point, and that the transmission is being maintained on standby until contact is re-established. The machine has been transmitting this message, cycling through the same tap pattern since contact was lost. It is reporting, in the patient mechanical way that automated systems report, that it is still here and still waiting for the entity it is in contact with to respond. One possible reading is that this transmitter is connected to a network that had more nodes than the game currently shows you, that the reference point it lost contact with is a location or installation that exists somewhere in the game's world but has not yet been found or documented. The transmitter is still sending its status because it was set up to keep sending until it received a response, and no response has come. It may be sending to something that is gone. It may be sending to something that still exists but cannot respond. The telegraph keeps tapping either way. Easter egg 48 is environmental and atmospheric rather than investigable directly. In several locations where arc structures are concentrated, particularly the larger installation sites, the physical shape of the arc structures interacts with wind patterns to produce a specific type of sound. The sound is not a simple tone, it is a harmonic, a sound produced by the resonance of the structure's geometry with moving air. Each large arc installation produces this harmonic at a specific pitch determined by its size and shape. And when multiple installations are within audio range of each other, which happens in certain zones, their harmonics combine. The combined harmonics of multiple arc installations, when they overlap, produce an interference pattern. The sound that results from that interference pattern has a regularity that distinguishes it from random environmental noise. It is periodic. It has a rhythm. And that rhythm, while not identical to any human musical meter, falls within a range that human hearing registers as ordered rather than random. The machines are making something that sounds like music by accident, or by design, or by some process that the game declines to characterize. One possible reading is that this harmonic effect is purely an emergent consequence of arc architecture placed in a natural environment. The structures were not designed to produce harmonics. They were designed for other purposes, and the harmonics are a byproduct of those designs interacting with wind. But the consistency of the harmonic character across arc installations of different types, and the fact that the combined effect falls within a range that human perception registers as ordered, is at least worth noting. The machines together sound like something, and that something is not random noise. Easter egg 49 is the final entry in this chapter and is one of the more straightforwardly mysterious details in the game. In a specific building that has no obvious power source connected to it, no generator, no visible solar supply, no connection to any larger grid infrastructure that could still be running, there is a telephone ringing, standard landline telephone ring, intermittent in a building that should have no electrical power. The phone rings. If you wait, it stops. If you come back, it rings again. The absence of any power source that could be feeding this phone is what makes it strange rather than atmospheric. The building itself is nondescript. It is not a special facility or a notable location. It is a mid-sized commercial building in a zone where similar buildings are scattered throughout. Nothing about it distinguishes it from its surroundings, except that a phone in it is ringing with no power source to explain the ring. Players who attempt to interact with the phone report that the game presents no interactable option. The phone rings and the player cannot answer it, which means the game is not using this as a trigger for additional content or a player interaction point. The phone just rings. One possible reading is that there is a power source that is not visible or has not been identified, a buried battery system, a connection to infrastructure that is not obvious from the surface. The phone is ringing because something is still powering it, and that something has simply not been located yet. This is the most rational reading and is almost certainly part of the answer. But even with a rational power source explanation, the phone in that specific building, ringing without a caller who can be answered, is the kind of detail that Ark Raiders specializes in. Something that is probably explicable, probably has a straightforward reason, and is still not quite right in a way that makes you think about it after you have moved on. Chapter 7. The Raiders themselves. Every chapter so far has been about the world around the Raiders, the environment they move through, the machines they face, the corporate and civic history of the place they inhabit. But the Raiders themselves, the players, and the various human characters who exist in the world of Ark Raiders leave their own traces in the environment. Easter eggs 50 through 57 are all about the human beings who came before you in this world. The previous teams, the earlier visitors, the people who were here and left evidence of their presence and their stories. These Easter eggs are in some ways the most collaborative part of the game's lore because they describe the history of people who are doing what you are doing. Easter egg 50 is graffiti. In several locations across the game's accessible zones, there are marks left by previous human visitors. Most of these are purely functional. Arrows indicating directions, warnings about hazards, markings that serve navigation purposes. But in certain locations, the graffiti goes beyond functional notation and tells a story. A sequence of marks in the same style, by the same hand based on the consistent, artistic character of the writing, appears across multiple locations in a way that implies a specific person or team passed through in a specific sequence. The marks tell a story across their sequence if you are familiar enough with the zones to recognize the pattern. They start in a location that corresponds to a standard entry point, and they progress through areas in a sequence that tells you something about what the person who left them was doing and what they were thinking as they did it. The early marks are practical and direct. The later marks become more personal. One of the final marks in the sequence, in a location far from the entry point, is not a navigation aid or a warning. It is something else. A name and a date and a phrase, not a functional mark, a record of presence. I was here. This is when. This is what I want to leave. One possible reading of this sequence of graffiti is that it is the record of a team's last known run, that the marks trace the final outing of a specific group of raiders, and that the last mark, with its name and date and phrase, was left by someone who knew or sensed that this was the last thing they would leave. The phrase itself, which I will not quote directly, is addressed outward. It is written as if it expects to be read by someone who comes later, which is exactly what it is being. Read by someone who came later. Easter egg 51 is a wall in a specific area of the game that serves as something of an informal gathering point based on the evidence of human use concentrated there. There is a memorial wall, names and dates, and sometimes short phrases, a record of raiders who did not come back. This is not unusual for a community that operates under the conditions the raiders face, and the wall itself is not hidden or obscure. But its contents reward close attention in a way that casual reading does not reveal. Certain names on the wall appear more than once. Not duplicates of the same person, the dates beside the names distinguish them, but people who share names appearing at different points on the timeline the wall documents. This suggests either that names recur naturally in a population large enough to produce overlaps, or that some of these shared names are intentional commemorations, children or later community members named after people who were lost. If the latter, the wall is not just a record of loss, it is a record of how a community processes loss, carrying names forward into the next generation as a form of continuation. The dates on the memorial wall also tell a story of their own. The frequency of additions to the wall is not consistent across the timeline it covers. There are periods of dense addition, many names in a short span of dates, and periods of relative quiet. The dense periods correspond, when you look at them against the broader context of the game's implied timeline, to events that involved high-arc activity or particularly dangerous zone conditions. The wall is a record of the relationship between the raiders and the machines, documented in human loss. Easter egg 52 is a personal log, in a location that requires some navigation to reach and is not on any obvious route through the zone. There is a small shelter that was clearly set up and used by a solo raider rather than a team. The space is personal and tight and organised in the specific way that individual spaces get organised when someone has been living in them alone for a while. And in this space there is a personal log. Written entries, spanning a period of time, in the handwriting of someone who was processing their experience through writing. The log is not complete, several pages are missing or damaged, but what remains covers a significant enough portion of the writer's experience to sketch a person. The entries describe specific runs, specific encounters, specific moments of decision and doubt. They also describe relationships with other raiders that illuminate the social texture of the world in ways the game rarely shows directly. The writer was connected to other people in ways they were clearly not fully comfortable expressing in person, based on the candor of the log versus what they described saying aloud to the same people. The log is where they were honest. One entry in the log is the one that stays with you. It is not the most action-filled or the most dramatic. It is an entry where the writer describes sitting in this same shelter on a night with a specific kind of quiet outside and thinking about a specific person who is no longer alive. The entry is brief and does not try to be beautiful. It is just honest about what it felt like to be where they were with that loss on that particular night. The shelter around that entry, still organised in the way the writer left it, still holding the log in a space they built for themselves, is one of the more affecting locations in the game. Easter egg 53 is about equipment modifications. Raiders in Ark Raiders customize their loadouts, and this is reflected in the weapons and gear found in the environment when examining areas previously visited by other players, or when finding the caches of earlier raider teams. Most modifications are standard, oriented toward performance improvement in obvious ways, but in one specific cache, the equipment within has been modified in ways that go beyond standard performance optimization. The modifications on the equipment in this cache are not all functional improvements. Some of them are oriented toward a very specific threat type, one that does not correspond to any of the Ark machine types that are standard in the zone where this cache is found. The modifications are optimal for a type of encounter that should not be common in this area based on documented Ark patrol patterns. Whoever left this cache had modified their equipment for something that others had either not encountered or not expected to encounter here. They prepared for a specific thing in a specific place, and then they left the equipment behind. One possible reading is that the raiders who left this cache had encountered a machine type or a threat variant in this zone that is not standardly documented, that their equipment modifications record an encounter that has not been formally captured in the game's broader knowledge base. The modification choices point towards something larger or more aggressive than standard patrol units, something that would require the specific adaptations made to this gear. What exactly they encountered is not revealed. The modifications are the only record of it. Easter egg 54 is a marked map. In a specific raider shelter, there is a hand-drawn map of a zone that supplements the standard navigational information available in the game. The hand-drawn additions include unmarked hazards, hidden routes, resource locations, standard supplemental knowledge, the kind that experienced raiders accumulate. But one marking on this map does not correspond to anything identifiable in the game world. It marks a specific location with a symbol used for points of interest, at a coordinate that, when you visit it, contains no obvious point of interest. An apparently empty space in the game world marked as significant on a raider's personal map. The notation beside this mark is brief and cryptic. The shorthand the raider used for their other notations is consistent and readable throughout the map, and those notations are sensible. This one is different. The words used are not the same shorthand as everything else. They appear to be a different notation system, suggesting either that this particular location required a different kind of note than everything else on the map, or that the raider was being deliberately obscure about this specific location relative to the others. One possible reading is that the marked location corresponds to a game element that has not yet been discovered or documented by the wider player community, that the raider who made this map knew something about this spot that has not yet been confirmed or found. This reading makes this Easter egg one of the most actively unresolved entries in this video, because it points toward the possibility of a secret that exists in the game world but has not yet been found. Easter egg 55 is about rations, specifically about the supply rations found in several raider caches that carry a specific stamped insignia. The insignia is not from any of the documented factions or supply sources that are part of the game's established world. It is not from any of the corporate entities discussed in Chapter 4. It is its own thing, a mark applied to supplies that should have an identifiable origin and do not. Someone is supplying certain raider caches with rations that carry an unidentifiable mark, and those rations are of higher quality than comparable supplies from known sources. The distribution of these marked rations across the game's zones is not random. They appear in specific types of locations, caches that meet certain characteristics in terms of their placement and their contents. Not every cache has them. Not every zone has them. But the pattern of where they appear is consistent with intentional placement rather than scavenging. Someone is putting these rations in specific places for raiders who will know where to look or who stumble upon the right kinds of locations. One possible reading is that there is a supply network operating in this world that is not part of the documented raider community or the known faction structure. An entity or a group that is actively supplying raiders with high-quality rations from an unidentified source, placing them in locations where they will be found by people who need them. The motivation for this, if it is deliberate, is not apparent from the rations alone, but the consistency of the mark and the quality of the supplies suggest an organization. Someone is out there doing something and leaving a mark on their work. Easter egg 56 is about overlapping territorial claims. In one specific location in the game, a raider shelter that shows signs of extended use by multiple occupants over time, the walls carry markings from two distinct and identified raider factions. Not coexisting markings, not collaborative tagging, but overlapping markings in a way that suggests sequential use. One faction marked the space first, and then another faction marked over or around those marks, claiming the same space. And then, in a detail that requires close examination to notice, the first faction marked it again. A response, a reclamation, a conversation happening in territorial notation on the walls of a shelter. The factional conflict implied by these overlapping marks is interesting in its own right, but what makes it an Easter egg is the specific sequence and what it implies about the relative presence of these factions in this zone over time. The initial claim, the counterclaim, the reclaim, traced across the same set of walls, tells you something about how this area of the game has been contested by humans independent of the arc threat. People were struggling over space in this world, even as they were struggling to survive in it. Easter egg 57 is the last entry in this chapter and involves a code in a specific location scratched into a wall surface with what appears to have been a hard tool rather than a marker or paint. There is a sequence of characters. The scratching is deliberate, clearly intentional, and the characters are arranged in a format that suggests encoded rather than plain language content. This is not the first encrypted or obscure notation in the game's world, and like some of the others, it rewards the players who take the time to work with it. The encoded message, when resolved through a cipher that is available within the game world through a separate discovery, directs the reader to a specific location and provides a brief description of what is there. The hidden cache it describes contains items that are notable for a combination of their quality and their specific selection. The items suggest that whoever left the cache and the code to find it had specific knowledge of what a raider in a specific situation would need, rather than assembling a general-purpose cache. The message and the cache together feel like a communication from one specific person to another specific person, accidentally left accessible to anyone who knows how to read it. Chapter 8. Environmental Warnings. The previous chapters have dealt with what the world contains and what various parties within it were doing. This chapter is about what the world is trying to tell you. Easter eggs 58 through 65 all concern environmental details that, when examined carefully, appear to be communicating something. Not always clearly, not always through language, but in ways that suggest intentionality behind the environment itself. Whether that intentionality belongs to surviving humans, to the Ark, or to something else is the question this chapter keeps raising. Easter egg 58 is a light phenomenon. In an interior space with windows that face a specific direction, at a specific time in the game's day cycle, when the sun angle produces the right geometry, shadows fall on the interior walls in a pattern that is not consistent with the architecture of the space. The structural elements producing the shadows should, based on their positions and dimensions, produce a different shadow arrangement than what actually appears. The shadows that do appear at that specific time and in that specific orientation form recognizable shapes, not random patterns. Shapes that a human viewer registers as shapes rather than arbitrary shadow. The shapes formed by the shadows are geometric and consistent across multiple in-game days, which means they are not a dynamic phenomenon, but a designed one. The window geometry and the structural elements were positioned to produce these specific shadow shapes at a specific time. The question is by whom and for what purpose? If this was human-designed, whoever built or modified this space arranged it to produce this specific visual effect during daylight hours. If it was the Ark, their construction is producing light patterns in occupied human spaces that form recognizable shapes. Either explanation is interesting. One possible reading is that this is a form of communication left by survivors who had reason to leave a message in a form that was not immediately readable. A shadow pattern that only appears under specific conditions is not going to be found by anyone who is not looking carefully and at the right time. It is a message addressed to someone specific, someone who would know when and where to look. What the shapes communicate is subject to interpretation and is left deliberately ambiguous by the game. Easter egg 59 is visible only from above, which means it requires either elevation in the game or the specific kind of attentive aerial observation that is unusual in normal play. On the floor of a large open space in the markings and discolorations of the surface, there is a pattern. From ground level, the surface looks like ordinary deteriorated flooring. From the right elevation, the surface markings resolve into a warning symbol, a recognizable alert indicator, the kind of shape that human societies have converged on for marking danger, formed in the surface of an ordinary seeming floor. The warning symbol formed by the floor markings is oriented specifically. It faces a particular direction, which means it was designed to be read by someone approaching from a specific approach angle at a specific altitude, not a general warning visible to anyone who looks down at the space. A warning addressed to someone coming from a specific direction. Given the flight paths of certain Ark units discussed in Easter egg 9, the approach direction toward which this symbol is oriented corresponds to a common Ark patrol approach vector. The symbol may be intended to be seen by the machines rather than by humans. One possible reading of this is that survivors or raiders left a message in a space where it would be interpreted not by humans, but by the Ark, in whatever way Ark machines process visual information. Whether the Ark would register a human-created warning symbol as meaningful is an open question, but the orientation of the symbol and its scale, which is large enough to be significant to an aerial viewer but not immediately obvious to a ground-level observer, suggest it was designed with a non-human audience in mind. Easter egg 60 is something living. In a specific location within the game world, a small garden has been cultivated. Plants that require ongoing care and water and specific conditions, growing in a cleared space that was obviously prepared for them. This garden is not a pre-Ark remnant. The plants are too young and the preparation of the growing space too recent. Someone created and has been maintaining this garden after the Ark event. In a world where most human activity is oriented towards survival and movement and avoiding detection, someone decided to plant a garden. The specific plants in this garden are not ornamental in the standard sense. They are functional, plants with uses in food preparation or medicine or both. The selection suggests knowledge and planning. but the act of planting them in an exterior space, visible and tended, rather than in a more concealed interior setup, suggests something beyond pure utility. You do not maintain a visible garden in a dangerous environment purely for survival purposes when more concealed options exist. The garden is a statement as much as it is a food source. One possible reading is that this garden belongs to someone who has either decided they are staying in this location long term, or who wants others passing through to know that someone is here and has been here and has committed enough to this place to plant things that will take time to grow. The garden is evidence of a kind of defiance, of a refusal to remain entirely in the survival posture that everything else in the world seems to demand. Someone planted things that will need to be tended for a season in a world that offers no guarantees about whether tomorrow will look like today. Easter egg 61 is a dead tree. This sounds unremarkable in a world full of environmental damage, but this specific tree is worth stopping at for longer than it takes to register it as dead vegetation. The tree is distinctive in scale and in position, located at a point that would have been a landmark in the pre-arc landscape, and someone has used this tree as a writing surface, not the trunk. The branches. On every branch of this tree that is within human reach, something has been carved. Not the same thing on every branch, different things, different languages, different symbols, different formats of notation. The tree has been used as a public message board by multiple different visitors over time. The accumulation of carvings on this tree makes it a record of everyone who has passed this specific landmark. Dates in at least a few of the carvings span a range that tells you the tree has been used as a writing surface for a significant period since the arc event. Multiple people across multiple visits left their marks. Some carvings are clearly navigational, pointing in specific directions. Some are personal, names and dates without further context. Some are in formats that suggest encryption or code, and at least one is in a script that does not correspond to any widely used writing system in the game's documented world. One possible reading of the unidentified script is that it belongs to a community or group with a private communication system, one that uses this tree as a public drop point for messages addressed to their own members, rather than to general passers-by. The public tree is a clandestine message board for a specific audience. Everyone else who carves a navigation note or a personal memorial on its branches is providing cover, making the unidentified script just one mark among many. Easter egg 62 is water-based, and like some other entries in this chapter, it requires a specific observational approach. In a ruined area, where water runs through channels and across surfaces in ways determined by the damage to the original drainage infrastructure, the flow patterns of the water have been, in at least one location, modified. Small redirects of flow, achieved through the placement of simple physical elements in the water's path, steer the water across a surface in a specific way. The path the modified water takes across this surface, when you observe it from the right angle, spells something. The redirects are simple enough that they could be coincidental, the result of debris landing in positions that happen to redirect water in a readable way. But several of the redirects are clearly not coincidental. Small stones and pieces of building material have been placed specifically and consistently enough to maintain the water's modified path across multiple game cycles and weather variations. They were placed deliberately. The water is being directed deliberately, and the result is a word or a phrase traced in the moving water across the surface. What the water spells is subject to interpretation because the medium is imprecise, but the most consistent reading of the water's modified path across multiple observations produces a word associated with warning or alertness, not a proper noun, not a navigation indicator. A general-purpose alert, written in the most ephemeral possible medium, in a location where you would only find it if you were looking carefully at the ground rather than at the horizon. Easter egg 63 is found in a cold zone, one of the areas in the game where temperatures are low enough to preserve things that warmer environments would have degraded. In one of these cold zones, on a surface that has been exposed to temperature fluctuations long enough to produce complex ice formations, the formations are not random. The shapes that the ice has built up in this specific location correspond to diagrams. Not organic ice crystal patterns, but angular geometric forms that match the schematic representations of Arc machine components. The ice has grown in the shapes of machine blueprints. The most straightforward explanation for this is that the ice is forming along surfaces or structures that themselves have the geometric properties of Arc components. If there are Arc machine parts or materials embedded in or near this surface, the ice could be conforming to those underlying forms rather than producing them spontaneously. This would explain the shape without requiring any more complex interpretation. But the surface itself is not obviously an Arc installation, and the schematic quality of the ice formations, their resemblance to two-dimensional technical drawings rather than three-dimensional objects, is unusual even if the underlying cause is structural conforming. One possible reading is that something in the material composition of certain Arc components affects the way ice nucleates and grows in their vicinity, producing formations that reflect the internal structure of the components rather than just their external shape. If the ice is growing along internal crystalline or structural features of the Arc materials, it would produce exactly this kind of schematic-looking external formation. The ice would be revealing, in a sense, the internal architecture of the Arc components embedded in this environment. Easter egg 64 is about colours. In a specific structure, there are lights arranged along a corridor in a way that is not consistent with standard facility lighting. The lights are of different colours, and their arrangement along the corridor is not based on any obvious spatial logic. Standard lighting spaces lights for coverage and uniformity. This arrangement is non-uniform in both spacing and colour distribution. The lights are arranged specifically. When you read the colour sequence as a code, using a system that exists within the game's world through a separate discoverable key, the colour sequence produces a message. The message is short, fewer than 10 words, and it references a specific location and a specific timing. A place to be at a specific time. A meeting point or a signalled location, communicated through a colour sequence in a corridor that most players would walk through without giving the light arrangement a second thought. Whether the meeting has already taken place, whether the timing referenced has already passed in the game's world chronology, and whether anyone responded to the message are all unanswerable from this detail alone. The colour code exists, the message is readable, and the logistics it describes exist in the game's geography. Everything else about it remains open. Easter egg 65 is the last entry in this chapter and is about animals. The game's world, while primarily focused on humans and machines, includes animals, wildlife that has persisted through or adapted to the post-Arc environment. These animals generally behave in ways consistent with standard environmental navigation, avoiding threats, seeking resources, maintaining the patterns of their species. But in specific proximity to certain Arc structures, a specific type of animal, a common wildlife species present throughout the game's environment, demonstrates a behavioural anomaly. The anomaly is avoidance, not the standard threat avoidance that all animals demonstrate toward loud or dangerous stimuli. A specific, persistent, directional avoidance of a defined area around certain Arc installations, even when the installation in question is not actively operating or producing the kinds of stimuli that would trigger standard threat avoidance. The animals route around these specific installations when moving through their territory, consistently and across multiple different individuals of the same species observed across multiple sessions. One possible reading is that these specific arc installations produce a stimulus that this particular animal species is sensitive to in ways that humans and human instrumentation have not fully detected. The infrasound discussed in Easter egg 45 is a candidate. If these specific installations produce that low-frequency output more intensely than other arc structures, animals sensitive to infrasound would avoid them more definitively. The behavioral pattern would then be evidence of a stimulus invisible to the player, documented in the behavior of the wildlife. The specific installations that the animals avoid are not the most obviously dangerous ones in their respective zones. They are not the active combat platforms or the most heavily armed patrol positions. They are quieter structures, installations that are present and functional, but not aggressively active. The animals avoid the quiet ones more definitively than the obviously dangerous ones. And that specificity points towards something about what the quiet installations are doing that is not apparent from observation. Chapter 9. The Unanswered Questions. We have arrived at the final chapter. Easter eggs 66 through 73 are the entries that, individually and together, point toward questions that the game has not yet answered and may never fully answer. These are the Easter eggs that feel most deliberately unresolved, as if they were placed specifically to create space for speculation rather than to deliver conclusions. I want to be especially clear in this chapter that what follows is interpretation and speculation rather than confirmed lore. These Easter eggs are open questions. I am going to offer readings, but I do not have answers. Nobody does yet. Easter egg 66 is a countdown timer. In a secure location, accessible only through a route that requires specific effort to navigate, there is a physical counting device, analog rather than digital, mechanical in its operation. It is running. The numbers it displays are decreasing with each movement of its mechanism, and the starting value and current value, combined with the rate of decrease, suggest that it is counting down to something in what the game implies is the not-too-distant future. The timer has no label, no associated document or notation that explains what it is counting toward. It exists in its secure location, counting, providing no context for what it is measuring. Its presence in a secure and non-obvious location suggests that whoever installed it intended it to be found only by someone looking for it. The security of the location is not excessive, but it is enough to filter out casual stumbling. The timer was placed somewhere that required intentional navigation, for a purpose that is not stated. One possible reading is that the timer is counting toward a specific event in the game's evolving world, something that the developers intended to reveal as part of a future content update or story development. If that reading is correct, the timer is a real countdown, running toward a real future disclosure. This interpretation has precedent in games that use in-world timers to build anticipation for actual game events. Another reading is that the timer represents a character's countdown within the fiction of the game world itself, that it was set by a specific person for a specific purpose that is entirely internal to the game's narrative, and that the countdown is towards something within that narrative rather than something tied to real-world development timelines. Under this reading, the timer is waiting for something that happens in the story, not in the development pipeline. What both readings share is that the timer is doing something real. It is not a static prop. It is running and it is approaching a specific value, and at some point it will reach that value. What happens at that point, whether in the world of the game or in its development, is the question the game is not answering yet. Easter egg 67 is about a toy. In an area that shows signs of having been a child's space, a bedroom, or a play area, there is a child's toy, a simple mechanical toy of the kind that moves when wound up or when a spring mechanism is triggered. This toy, in a world where most mechanical devices have long since run down or stopped functioning, is still occasionally active. Not continuously, intermittently. It moves, it performs its mechanical motion, it stops, and later it moves again. The movement of the toy is not continuous enough to suggest a running mechanism. Between active periods, the toy is fully still, for intervals that are too long for a wound-down mechanism that is about to stop. The movement happens in spurts, each one complete and deliberate in its mechanical quality, separated by intervals of full stillness. The pattern of activation does not correspond to player proximity, light levels, or any obvious environmental trigger. It appears to activate on its own schedule. One possible reading is that the toy is connected to a source of intermittent power, perhaps a small battery system that charges from a connection to the game's still active infrastructure and discharges in the toy's mechanism before charging again. The intermittent activation would then be a function of the charge cycle rather than any more mysterious cause. This is technically coherent. The toy sits in a space where children were, in a world where children are not, and moves on its own schedule regardless of whether anyone is there to see it. The more evocative reading is the one that the game does not endorse but does not prevent.